I just want to make sure that someone can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I do. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing. Before we begin, I'd like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you'd like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to our offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I'd also like to remind all members that guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician states that face coverings are required for all meetings in an enclosed space, such as committee hearings. I expect all members on both sides of the aisle to wear a mask for the duration of today's hearing. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's hearing is the first in a series that the subcommittee will hold to develop legislation to promote competition online and to modernize the antitrust laws. These hearings follow a 16-month bipartisan investigation led by the subcommittee last Congress, which produced significant evidence of the rise and abuse of gatekeeper power online. In testimonies, submissions, and numerous interviews with subcommittee staff, businesses of all types and sizes described how dominant platforms exploit their gatekeeper power to charge exorbitant fees, advantage their own products and services, impose oppressive contract terms, and extract valuable data from the people and businesses that rely on them. Over and over again, words like fear and hardship permeated the concerns of businesses across the economic spectrum, app developers, innovators, and locally owned companies alike. According to these businesses, their dependence on platform gatekeepers to access users and markets are simply the cost of doing business because they have few, if any, other options. In one example, David Hanheimer Hansen, the co-founder of Basecamp, testified last Congress that Apple's power over app developer was, quote, complete tyranny and insufferable, adding that developers live in constant fear we may have violated these vague rules and the next update to our applications will be blocked by Apple, end quote. This power is also critical for the platforms to maintain their grip on the market. By having control over the infrastructure of the digital age, these firms can conduct surveillance over other businesses to identify potential rivals and ultimately buy or bury any competitive threats. For example, during the investigation, the subcommittee uncovered emails from Mark Zuckerberg to Facebook's chief financial officer describing the purpose of Instagram as neutralizing a competitive threat. Before it was acquired, the co-founder of Instagram told an investor that he was worried Mr. Zuckerberg would go into, quote, destroy mode if he refused to sell the company. Facebook later acquired the surveillance company Anavo to identify other competitive threats and then neutralize them through acquisition, cloning their features or blocking them from Facebook's platform. In advance of today's hearing, we've also received written testimony from Cliff Pemble, the CEO of Garmin, about this topic. He notes that as gatekeepers of the app ecosystem for virtually all app developers, Apple and Google, and I quote, have the ability and incentive to harm competition, and that these super dominant companies should not be allowed to use their ability to control key inputs and distribution as a sword to eliminate or impede competition, end quote. Due to high barriers to entry in these markets, such as strong network effects and high switching costs, new entrants are unable to enter the market with better products or services to contest the dominance of these firms. In other words, businesses and consumers are stuck with few or no alternatives. I want to be very clear about two things. First, this problem is not just about a market failure. At its core, this issue is fundamentally about whether or not we will have an economy where businesses fighting for economic survival can actually succeed. It's about whether our economic future is going to be defined by the success of the best businesses with the best ideas or simply the biggest companies with the biggest lobbying budgets. Second, this problem goes far beyond the exchange of dollars and data online. It's also at the heart of our nation's reckoning with domestic terrorism and hate speech. In a letter to Facebook requesting documents and information related to the spread of disinformation on its platform earlier this week, my colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee wrote, and I quote, from conspiracy theorists peddling false information to extremist voices urging and organizing violence, Facebook has become a breeding ground for polarization and discord, end quote. As Chairman Pallone and Subcommittee Chairs Schakowsky, Doyle, and DeGette explained, Phrases like kill them all and lock and load appeared thousands of times on Facebook pages in the days and months leading up to the violent mob's attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Rather than bringing the world closer together, Facebook functioned as an organizing tool for extremists to plot violence against our democracy and plan to kidnap public officials. Last year, dozens of civil rights leaders from the Anti-Defamation League, the NAACP, Color of Change, and other groups organized a boycott by more than 500 advertisers following Facebook's refusal to tackle hate speech on its platform. In response, Mark Zuckerberg reportedly said that Facebook is, quote, not going to change our policies or approach on anything because of a threat to a small percent of our revenue or to any percent of our revenue, end quote. That is because in the absence of competition or accountability, Facebook and other dominant platforms have no incentive to change. This problem is a cancer that is metastasizing across our economy and our country. It's spreading through our body politic and taking over our ability to function as a democracy. Americans have had enough. According to multiple surveys over the past year, Republicans and Democrats agree on an overwhelming basis that these companies have too much power and that Congress must curb this dominance. Today's hearing begins the process of doing just that. And mark my words, change is coming, laws are coming. Every day, policymakers around the world are undertaking a similar process. In Europe, the European Commission has developed the Digital Markets Act, a comprehensive set of rules for platform gatekeepers that will now be considered by the European Parliament. In the United Kingdom, the government has announced that its Competition and Markets Authority will create a digital markets unit to enforce a competition regime for tech giants to give consumers more choice and control over their data and ensure businesses are treated fairly. In Australia, the Parliament is finalizing a law produced by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission to give news publishers greater bargaining power with online platforms. And several other countries have announced similar proposals. As Margrethe Vestager, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, has said, we have a choice, a set of clear, strong requirements, or a completely fragmented legal system. I would also add that virtually every other sector of the economy is subject to rules and safeguards. The digital marketplace should be no different. In communication markets, there are decades of laws of regulation to complement the breakup of AT&T. In pharmaceutical markets, Congress enacted the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984 to lower prescription drug costs through the benefits of generic competition, and we have added to this with recent laws like the CREATES Act to foster competition and lower prescription drug costs by billions of dollars. By comparison, the market capitalization of Amazon alone is larger than that of AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson combined. And while we need more competition in every market across the economy, unlike the firms in these other sectors, Amazon and other dominant platforms are virtually unbound by law or regulation. But that time is coming to an end. It must end. Today's hearing is the beginning. We'll hear from a panel of experts on several of these topics, which will build on the testimony and information we received as part of our investigation last Congress. In the coming weeks, we will hold several additional hearings to consider reforms to our antitrust laws and pass forward for ensuring the survival of trustworthy sources of news. We'll also hold additional hearings as necessary to develop a comprehensive record in support of legislative reforms. And we will work on a serious bipartisan basis to advance these reforms together. In the words of my colleague and friend, Ranking Member Buck, quote, we have an opportunity to offer bipartisan solutions that will promote competition and build a better technology marketplace for the future, end quote. I agree. And with that, it is my pleasure now to recognize the gentleman from Colorado, the ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee, Mr. Buck, for purposes of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I also want to thank you for your bipartisan and thorough nature in which you conducted the antitrust investigation into Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google in the last Congress. During the hearings last year, we heard numerous examples of the exclusionary and predatory conduct that Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google have engaged in. For example, Google and Facebook colluded to control the ad marketplace. Amazon demanded proprietary information from small businesses who are forced to use their platform and then use the small businesses' data to make their own products and relegated the competitors lower in their search results. And Apple exacting a 30% tax from its competitors like Spotify because these companies have no way for their customers to download their app other than going through Apple's App Store or Google's Play Store. Additionally, we have seen all four of the tech giants take unprecedented actions to silence political speech they disagree with, which almost always exclusively means shutting down conservative speech. Just since early October 2020, we have seen Google's YouTube platform delete numerous conservative channels, Facebook deplatform the President of the United States, Amazon kick Parler off its web hosting service, and Google and Apple block Parler from their app stores. Whether their conduct is directed at potential competitors or at politicians and citizens they don't agree with, these companies are able to act with complete impunity because of their status as monopolies. The status quo is not working, and we must act. But the key is to make sure that we do not take a chainsaw to the whole economy, but rather we should implement a scalpel-like approach for big tech. I believe there are several areas where we can work together on this: increasing funding for antitrust enforcement agencies, enacting data portability and interoperability requirements, and reforming the burden of proof in merger cases, among others. I would like to discuss some of these in detail. As we have discussed previously, I believe that consumer-oriented data portability and interoperability policies will further facilitate competition in the marketplace. Perhaps one of the most popular and pro-competitive actions Congress ever took was mandating mobile phone number portability in the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Consumers were empowered to shop between carriers without having to worry about changing phone numbers. The result was a competitive and pro-consumer marketplace. This is the model regarding data portability as it applies to online platforms. In the mobile phone space, companies fought to get your phone number and your business. In the digital world, companies want your data and the ability to monetize that data. The core question before Congress in this area is, what data is portable? For example, should a search term entered into Google by Google Should a search term entered into Google by a consumer be portable data? What about data that is collected passively by Google, like location data? I think a Supreme Court case from 2018 gives an interesting bit of context here. In the Carpenter case, the court noted that it is basically a necessity of modern life that we have mobile phones and carry them around with us. The court found that just carrying your phone around cannot constitute consent for law enforcement to track your movements via cell tower pings without getting a warrant. The type of location tracking that Google is doing is far more sophisticated and precise than cell tower pings. How is it possible that the type of micro-targeting and tracking Google engages in is permitted with essentially no benefit to the consumer? This type of data is incredibly valuable to companies, and consumers should be able to control who has access to the data that results from literally every aspect of their lives being tracked. They should also be able to reap benefits from their data besides a better ad experience. Maybe it's just me, but I would rather get access to publications behind a paywall or airline miles or hotel points rather than a better ad experience when I hand over my data. By making data portable, you put power back in the hands of consumers and leave it up to them who gets access to it and under what conditions. Similar to data portability, which is about the platform to consumer relationship, interoperability can also help competition in digital marketplaces. Interoperability is a time-honored practice in the tech industry that allows competing technologies to speak to one another so that consumers can make a choice without being locked into any one technology. In the same way that data portability helps markets function better, so can interoperability. But interoperability does not work in uncompetitive digital markets where dominant platforms have locked consumers into their technology. On this issue, I agree with the chair that there is room to explore. As with data portability, the devil will be in the details, and we will want to ensure that any interoperability mandates do not create spillover effects or result in heavy-handed regulation. Lastly, I think we may be able to find common ground in keeping big tech from getting bigger. In the third way report, I outlined that I did not agree with pursuing a Glass-Steagall for the internet approach. I continue to believe that approach is one fraught with potential problems. I think much more robust enforcement by our law enforcement agencies with regards to mergers and acquisitions would accomplish essentially the same goal. It is a big problem for consumers and market competition that these tech titans' buying spree has continued unabated for essentially the past 20 years. Estimates vary, but the number of deals involving digital platforms stands at approximately 750 over the past 2 decades. This M&A activity appears to have significantly strengthened the platform's market power, and yet the vast majority of the deals were cleared by our antitrust agencies without scrutiny. In addition to much more scrutiny of mergers and acquisitions, I think we should consider shifting the burden to the digital platforms to demonstrate that their proposed acquisition or merger is pro-competitive and pro-consumer. In closing, we have to do something. Throwing partisan mud at one another is not going to work. These are people and businesses whose lives are actually being destroyed by these tech giants. Complacency is not an option. I look forward to working with you in these areas, Mr. Chairman, and others in a bipartisan fashion to make the digital marketplace more competitive and more consumer-focused. Mr. Chair, thank you for your collegiality, and I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member for his opening statement. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's important hearing on gatekeeper power. It's been over a century since Congress enacted the first of several major federal antitrust statutes. Beginning with the Sherman Act in 1890, these laws were passed to preserve and promote competition. Earlier this week, Attorney General nominee Merrick Garland quoted Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black for the principle that antitrust law is the charter of American economic liberty. Today, however, this charter is in a state of disrepair. Across many industries, economic power is concentrated among a few powerful firms with outsized influence over our democracy, our jobs, and our social institutions. The committee's bipartisan investigation into digital markets uncovered abundant evidence of both anti-competitive conduct and harmful consolidation. The lack of competition online and across our entire economy demonstrate an urgent need for action. As we all know, a lack of competition and anti-competitive conduct is not just limited to social networks or online commerce. These problems show up in other critical markets. For example, it is well documented that the lack of competition in healthcare markets has been one of the primary causes of the skyrocketing price of prescription drugs and other healthcare costs. Over the past several decades, labor markets across America have also become highly concentrated. Just as consolidation in product markets tends to have harmful effects for consumers, the growing concentration of labor markets has saddled workers with depressed wages and fewer opportunities, something often called monopsony. As our country begins to recover from the pandemic and the resulting economic crisis, non-compete and no-poach clauses impede the ability of workers to re-enter the workforce or find better jobs. This is unacceptable. It is clear that lax enforcement by regulators, combined with the court's undue narrowing of the law, has played a large role in creating the poor state of American economic liberty and the present monopoly crisis. With today's hearing, we take an important step in the process of restoring competition online. The rise and abuse of gatekeeper power by a few dominant firms has undermined the goals of the open internet. Instead of having an open competitive ecosystem, online gatekeepers can and do put a thumb on the scale in favor of their own businesses and against innovators, entrepreneurs, and startups. Simply put, this allows them to pick winners and losers rather than compete on the merits. Moreover, there is growing evidence that insufficient competition online has reduced the incentive for powerful companies to implement privacy protections or to address the rise and spread of hateful rhetoric and misinformation on their platforms. Despite public pressure, including many from civil rights community leaders, the lack of competitive marketplace results in many firms becoming simply too big to care. It is abundantly clear that competition online is not simply a click away. High barriers to entry, such as network effects and switching costs, protect the incumbent's market power and make it nearly impossible for new entrants to get a foothold. Over the last 2 years, this subcommittee, under the leadership of Chairman Cicilline, has conducted the most significant congressional antitrust investigation in more than a generation. Having identified and studied the problem last Congress, we must now legislate and exercise our oversight mandate in support of a solution. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel of witnesses on these important topics. I thank Chairman Cicilline and Ranking Member Buck for their work last Congress and for holding today's hearing. and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair thanks the gentleman for yielding back, and I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chairman in his opening remarks seemed to suggest that platforms should censor more. I want them to stop censoring conservatives. I want them to stop censoring speech. I want them to embrace the First Amendment. And frankly, if platforms are going to continue to undermine the First Amendment and other liberties that Americans enjoy, Section 230 protection should go away. It's really that basic. And I hope that's what this subcommittee will focus on in this Congress, is addressing the real concerns we are seeing happening to the very First Amendment, to the Bill of Rights, where free speech rights have been attacked time and time again. And typically, it's conservatives who've been attacked. And frankly, every other potential remedy should be on the table as well. It is that important. This is the Judiciary Committee, and we're talking about the First Amendment. So I hope that's the focus as we move forward with this important hearing and other hearings that are coming in this committee. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
It is now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Our first witness is Charlotte Slaiman, Competition Policy Director at Public Knowledge. Before joining Public Knowledge, Ms. Slaiman worked at the Anti-Competitive Practices Division of the Federal Trade Commission, investigating and litigating antitrust conduct violations. Additionally, she worked as a legislative aide to former Senator Al Franken, handling elements of his Judiciary Committee portfolio, including competition, media, and consumer privacy. Ms. Slaiman received her bachelor's from the University of Virginia and her JD from the New York University School of Law. Our second witness is Hal Singer, Managing Director of Econ 1 and Adjunct Professor at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. He is an expert on antitrust and regulation and has extensive experience providing policy advice to regulatory agencies in the United States and Canada. Before becoming the Managing Director at Econ 1, Dr. Singer served as the Principal at Economists, Inc. and the Managing Director at Navigant Economics. In 2018, the American Antitrust Institute honored Dr. Singer with an Antitrust Enforcement Award for his work on the Litiderm antitrust litigation. Dr. Singer received his bachelor's degree at Tulane University and received both his master's and PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University. Our third witness is Eric Gundersen, Chief Executive Officer of Mapbox, a mapping and location cloud platform for developers. They have helped companies like Facebook, CNN, the Weather Channel, and the New York Times create dynamic maps to enhance their products and content. Mr. Gundersen knows firsthand how difficult it can be to compete in an online marketplace when firms like Google have such dominant positions. Prior to joining Mapbox, Mr. Gundersen worked with mapping technology and open data space at Development Seed, a firm that creates open source tools for international development agencies. Mr. Gundersen received both his bachelor's and master's degree from American University. Our fourth witness, Tad Lipsky, is the Assistant Professor and Director of the Competition Advocacy Program at the Global Antitrust Institute at the Anton Scalia Law School. Prior to joining the Global Antitrust Institute, Professor Lipsky served as an acting director of the FTC's Bureau of Competition from February 2017 to July 2017. Over his storied career in antitrust law, Professor Lipsky has served as the Coca-Cola Company's chief antitrust lawyer, the first international officer of the American Bar Association's section of antitrust law, and as the co-chair of the International Competition Policy Working Group of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Professor Lipsky received his master's and JD from Stanford University. Our fifth witness, John Thorne, is a partner at Kellogg, Henson, Todd, Fiegel, and Frederick. He has had a long career as an antitrust attorney and has been recognized multiple times by Global Counsel Awards as one of the best corporate competition lawyers in the world. Currently, he represents media companies, publishers, financial service providers, app developers, and consumer products companies in commercial litigation in federal and state courts, as well as before law enforcement agencies. Before joining Kellogg Hansen, Mr. Thorne served as Verizon's Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel in charge of competition, intellectual property, and privacy. Mr. Thorne received his bachelor's degree from Kenyon College and his JD from Northwestern University School of Law. Today's last witness, Morgan Harper, is currently a senior advisor at the American Economic Liberties Project. Ms. Harper is an expert in consumer protection and education issues and has spent her career working to strengthen local businesses and reduce monopoly power. Prior to joining AELP, Ms. Harper served as Vice President of Knowledge Management and Strategy at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, the nation's largest community development financial institution. She has also spent time working as a special advisor to the Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Ms. Harper received her bachelor's degree from Tufts University, her master's from Princeton University, and her JD from Stanford Law School. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses, and we thank them for their participation. I will begin by swearing in our witnesses, and I ask our witnesses who are here to testify in person to rise, and I ask our witnesses testifying remotely to turn on their audio and make sure that I can see your face and your raised right hand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. And I would just remind the witnesses that your written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time frame, there's a timing light in WebEx and also on your tables. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have about a minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes has expired. I now recognize Ms. Slaiman for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, Chairman Nadler, and Ranking Member Jordan. It's an honor to have this opportunity to testify before you today on behalf of Public Knowledge. I'm Charlotte Slaiman, Competition Policy Director at Public Knowledge, a nonprofit that has represented the public interest for 20 years. We value an open internet, free expression, and access to affordable communications tools and creative works for everyone. I'm an antitrust lawyer and a former antitrust enforcement attorney at the Federal Trade Commission in the Anti-Competitive Practices Division. Competition is often the best way to make companies pay attention to what the people want. When companies face few competitors and are protected by high barriers to entry, they find they can ignore the interests of everyone else. That's where you come in. This subcommittee has undertaken a year-long investigation, an in-depth staff report, a series of hearings on the problems with competition and dominant digital platforms, and now this series of hearings to address those problems. This subcommittee is digging in and doing the work, building a record for new laws and rules that can actually promote competition on and against the most powerful digital platforms. Important antitrust cases have already been filed by enforcers of both parties against Google and Facebook, but it is still vitally important that Congress take up these concerns in a more proactive and comprehensive manner than antitrust alone can achieve. This hearing rightly zeroes in on the concept of gatekeeper power, the special power that platforms have over businesses and consumers that rely on them to reach each other. This power is the root of the problem. Gatekeepers can impose contract terms like high prices or unfair data access requirements. Gatekeepers can also use their power to protect themselves from potential competitive threats. By discriminating and by withholding interoperability, gatekeepers can pick themselves as winners in a market while ensuring rivals and potential rivals remain losers. These gatekeepers exploit incumbency advantages or barriers to entry, features of the market that make it especially difficult for anyone to challenge the gatekeeper. Network effects, especially prevalent among these digital platforms, occur when a platform becomes exponentially better and more useful as more and more users join the service. This creates a chicken and egg problem for a new entrant. You need users to get users. Sheer size can keep customers locked in, even when there are superior options available. When the problem is network effects, the solution is interoperability. Both the subcommittee's majority report and the ranking member's third way report highlighted interoperability as a potential remedy. Public Knowledge believes there can be bipartisan consensus on interoperability, and we are excited to work with you to make that happen. Just as our phone networks are already interoperable, you don't have to worry whether the person you're calling is on Verizon's or AT&T's network. Facebook should be required to offer interoperability with its network to competitors and potential competitors. For a new social network, this would help address that chicken and egg problem. Innovative competitors could compete on a level playing field with dominant platforms. Interoperability requirements like this are absolutely necessary to reinvigorate competition on and against digital gatekeepers. Interoperability creates lasting change to the structure of platform markets. For markets where a gatekeeper controls access to key components, it will be incredibly difficult to sustain multiple competitors without interoperability, leaving us again with the gatekeeper problem. Interoperability requirements should be carefully tailored to maximize competition and innovation. They will need to change as technology changes. Finding and choosing the most efficient options requires a level of technical detail and frequent updating best suited for an agency regulator. Congress should give clear rulemaking authority to an agency to require interoperability from gatekeeper platforms for competitors or potential competitors that meet baseline privacy and safety requirements. In conclusion, the world we live in today, where a single company can dominate search, shopping, or social networking, is not inevitable. It is instead the result of our policy choices. We have a market structure that tends towards monopoly because policymakers have chosen not to intervene yet. But it is not too late to make a different choice. Congress, led by this subcommittee's sterling work, can and indeed must pass new laws like interoperability and non-discrimination requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Singer for 5 minutes. If you can just be sure your microphone is on, Dr. Singer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and the rest of the committee for inviting me here today. It is an honor to testify. Big Tech's two-part strategy of cloning edge content, followed by steering users to their clones or self-preferencing, presents the greatest threat to edge innovation and is arguably the most vexing monopoly problem in our lifetimes. Starting an e-commerce business, or developing a killer app, or designing a website is a new and critical pathway to the middle class. The platform's two-part exclusionary strategy of cloning and self-preferencing the clones threatens this pathway for many entrepreneurs and thus threatens the American dream. In light of the findings of the majority report, there is no need to revisit the question of whether the digital platforms are dominant in their dealings with certain input providers. They are. Amazon and Apple have buying power with respect to merchants and app developers on their respective platforms, as evidenced by increasing or excessive take rates. Google is dominant with respect to certain websites, as evidenced by its power to disappear disfavored sites in search. The question now is what to do about this dominance. Unlike the Europeans, there is no protection against abuse of dominance here. Antitrust law cannot assist harmed trading partners unless the offender's dominance is supported by a restraint of trade. And all too often, it must be a restraint that crosses the firm's boundaries and results in higher consumer prices. While Amazon's requirement to purchase fulfillment services can and should be challenged under antitrust law, Amazon's residual market power over merchants cannot. Similarly, while Apple's exclusionary provisions in app developer contracts can be challenged under antitrust law, Apple's residual market power over app developers cannot. Given this gap in protection, there is an urgent need to supplement antitrust enforcement with regulatory protections. There are two policy options. The first is structural separation or a line of business restriction. You can be the platform, but you can't also own the content riding over the platform. Because structural separation only covers control through ownership, this approach must be bolstered with rules against control via contracting, such as bans on exclusive dealing. The second option is a non-discrimination regime, which would allow platforms to have a toe in the content space, but would prevent them from leveraging their platform power into that content. Non-discrimination would be modeled after Section 616 of the Cable Act, which passed on a bipartisan basis. The program carriage rules of the Act prevent cable operators from disfavoring independent networks that compete against the cable operator's network. As with program carriage, non-discrimination here would be enforced with a private right of action for victims of discrimination. Now, no proposal is a panacea. Line of business restrictions would solve the problem of cloning and self-preferencing, but to the extent that platforms have anything of value to add in the content space, that value would be eliminated. A non-discrimination regime would permit cloning, but would prevent the platform from monetizing the clone via self-preferencing. Yet the non-discrimination regime would have to be policed by a tribunal, which would entail monitoring costs and could be gamed by platforms with superior information. There's a hybrid approach that I'd like the committee to consider. Congress could empower a tribunal with the authority to offer 3 types of relief as it polices acts of discrimination. 1, injunctive relief. 2, damages to the victims of discrimination. And 3, structural separation. In cases involving a recidivist discriminator who shows no respect for the non-discrimination regime, or where injunctive relief proves unworkable, the tribunal could require the platform to sell off its content arm or cease operations in the content space. My embrace of non-discrimination rules today doesn't mean it's the only portion of the majority report's recommendations I support. I also embrace the report's call to nullify bad legal precedent that created unnecessary impediments for antitrust plaintiffs, beginning with the American Express decision. Now, I'll close by raising one final point in remedy design. The non-discrimination regime, or any regime requiring the platform's cooperation and respect for the rule of law, is vulnerable to the extent that the platform believes it is above the law. Recent developments imply that certain platforms have accumulated so much economic and political power that they may not be governable, which militates in favor of cutting them down in size. Amazon preemptively sued Attorney General Letitia James of New York for considering new worker safety protections. Google threatened to shutter its search engine in Australia in retaliation for a new law that compels Google to share a portion of the advertising revenues it earns off the backs of newspapers. Facebook blocked links to news stories from Australian news publishers and users and even launched its own Supreme Court. Accordingly, this committee should draft 2 bills, one that imposes structural separation with the aforementioned safeguards right out of the gate, and a second that imposes a non-discrimination regime with structural separation incorporated as a remedy. I look forward to your questions, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singer. I now recognize Mr. Gundersen for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, Chairman Nadler, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Eric Gundersen. I'm co-founder and CEO of Mapbox, a mapping and location company. We make maps, but we don't have an app that you can download. Our customers are developers. We provide the technology, APIs and SDKs that let them add maps to their apps and websites, from weather maps to delivery apps, major news sites, social messaging, and automotive. And maps are critical to future industries as well, from drones to delivery, electric vehicles, autonomous driving, and augmented reality navigation. This work, it all started in 2009. I was in Afghanistan supporting the State Department, digitizing old Soviet maps ahead of the country's first democratic presidential election. We needed better mapping tools to do our job, so we built those tools. In fact, we did it all from DC, not far from where you're sitting. We then opened our tools up to other businesses, launching Mapbox as a platform for everyone. Today, we're the largest independent mapping company, and our main competitor is Google Maps. That said, it's all relative when you're competing against giants. Analysts estimate that Google Maps, if it was a standalone company, it would be valued at more than $60 billion. And that was a couple years ago, so I'm sure it's gone higher. This committee is holding a hearing to better understand how gatekeeping works. So let me be clear. The gatekeeping is brazen and happening right in front of us, posted on Google's website in their own terms of service. There's a lot that can be said about how we got to this point, but I want to focus on what needs to be done today. I need your help now. My customers need your help now. I need Google Maps to stop bullying and intimidating customers who want to pay both for Google search and use Mapbox Maps. The problem is Google uses its dominance in search to suppress competition in maps. Look, all of us have searched for something on Google. All of us have looked at a Google map. All of us can see that search and maps, they're different products. But Google's terms of service state that if you're a developer using Google search on a map, that the map has to be a Google map instead of any other company's map, like Mapbox. So in order to use Google search with a map, developers are forced to use Google Maps and only Google Maps. There's no technical reason to restrict this interoperability. Customers, developers, they should be able to buy whatever maps they think are the best solution for their needs without anti-competitive interference from Google. This problem is getting worse. More and more of our customers have been targeted by these exclusionary practices over the years. which forces them to stop using us. And not because Google Maps is a better product, but because Google's restrictive terms of service. Tying together Google search with Google Maps is not just anti-competitive for Mapbox. It impacts a huge number of developers and customers because it prevents developers from building the best product possible. And we've watched customers spend months dismantling what they had built because of threats from Google. This problem will get more complicated in the future with subscription bundling of services and bulk pricing that creates ecosystem lock-in. I mean, just look at the deal last week with Google Maps and Ford. That's a six-year, several billion-dollar deal that not only locks Ford into Google Maps and Google Automotive Services, but also obligates Ford to use Google Cloud rather than staying with Microsoft Azure. So gatekeeping today not only drives short-term dollars to Google, it's blocking competition. Long-term, it's blocking product development and innovation because look, maps get better the more people that use them. By blocking customers from using Mapbox today, Google deprives us of the data and scale we need to grow and make better products, which makes it harder for us to build more competitive maps and compete against Google in the future. And all of this is hurting our customers and developers and the products they're building. Mapbox has been fortunate thanks to the talented team that has built some amazing technology and the developer community who believes in us. But we're an exception. I mean, I remember starting and how many people told us that we were crazy to take on Google. Well, how many folks had great ideas and didn't make it this far? We're losing out on innovation because of this chilling effect. We want to be able to compete on a level playing field, to be able to sell our products to customers who want them. Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, and other members of the committee for the great reports that you're already putting out and the attention you're paying to this issue. The committee has already done important work describing the problem. Now we need rules of the road that aren't only clear, but actually enforced. It's an honor of a lifetime to be called upon you today to discuss how we help our country build a stronger economy and continue improving America's competitiveness and innovation. Thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Gundersen. Professor Lipsky is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee. Very grateful for the opportunity to address you today at this hearing. The U.S. has been the world's leading economic powerhouse for decades, and it is the unquestioned innovation leader not only in digital technology, but in most other fields of advanced technology as well. Although many laws and policies create the framework that shape this extraordinary record of success, our antitrust enforcement system must be given substantial credit, as it is our main system of government control for business conduct applicable throughout our competitive private enterprise economy. There is no evident basis for declaring any systemic failure of our antitrust laws or its enforcement institutions, and there's no evident basis for declaring a crisis or attempting to impose foundational or drastic changes of those laws and institutions. Of course, we should always be willing to examine the details of the system and propose adjustments after a thorough vetting of potential consequences, both intended and unintended. And of course, the broad picture of profound success of our economy and our antitrust enforcement system should not immunize or excuse any specific anti-competitive conduct. The success of our antitrust system can be attributed to 4 elements. First, the key substantive provisions of the antitrust laws have always focused on prohibiting anti-competitive conduct, restraints of trade, monopolization, anti-competitive structural transactions. Second, from the very start in 1890, our antitrust enforcement laws were backed up by very powerful tools, both civil and criminal enforcement by the Department of Justice, private treble damage actions by anybody injured by an antitrust violation. From 1914, the FTC provided administrative enforcement, and additional enforcement options are available to state attorneys general, including by parens patriae actions. Moreover, each of these enforcement tools has been dramatically enhanced by later amendment, including escalation of criminal violations from misdemeanors to felonies, enormous increases in maximum criminal sentences and fines, the creation of very powerful civil class action procedures, passage of the Clayton Act and the Seller-Kefauver amendments to the Clayton Act, and the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, among many others. Third, interpretation of the key statutes has been entrusted to our Article 3 federal courts to work out via the common law process the particular rules that apply to the myriad forms of anti-competitive conduct that have been encountered over the 130 years since passage of the Sherman Act. Our Article 3 courts have proven to be a uniquely powerful and effective mechanism for shaping the very brief and general prohibitions in the antitrust statutes into a workable and effective system of controlling an enormous variety of competitive conduct encountered throughout our massive, complex, and dynamic economy in so many different circumstances and under so many distinct competitive and technological conditions. Fourth, after a long period of consideration and a certain degree of trial and error, the antitrust enforcement community, the Supreme Court, the antitrust agencies, antitrust law and economic scholars, practitioners, and other members of the community have coalesced around a consensus that firms accused of antitrust violations should be entitled to defend themselves, and that the antitrust laws should be construed to safeguard vigorous dynamic competition rather than specific competitors or other specific economic stakeholders. We should not alter these fundamental characteristics on which the strength and success of our antitrust enforcement system is based. This is especially when, as now, each of the leading technology companies is under specific challenge in particular antitrust cases brought by the FTC, the Antitrust Division, private parties, and dozens of state attorneys general. To consider major shifts in substantive antitrust standards or enforcement mechanisms prior to resolution of this litigation suggests fundamental distrust of the judiciary, which has played such a key role in the effective implementation of our antitrust statutes over time. That being said, some of the proposals contained in the majority staff report and recommendations are worthy of consideration. Since my time is short, I want to mention just a couple that seem to me to deserve particular consideration, and those are the proposals for interoperability and proposals for portability of data. I think there is a family resemblance to mobile number portability, denied boarding compensation, do not call registry, and other ready-to-hand consumer aids that lower barriers to entry and assist the process of competition, which I think is our best safeguard of a competitive digital technology sector. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Lipsky. I now recognize Mr. Thorne for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, members of the subcommittee, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, I am honored to appear before the subcommittee. The views I express are just mine, nobody else's. I represent both antitrust plaintiffs and defendants. Working on both sides of the V, I have both positive and some cautionary suggestions to offer as you consider legislation to energize antitrust enforcement and address gateway power. There is an urgent need for energetic, aggressive law enforcement. To quote a friend and noted price theorist, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Economic freedom does not sustain itself. It must be actively advanced and defended. I have 4 specific recommendations to offer. First, resources and expedition. Antitrust cases are hugely expensive. We need more enforcement. That requires more funding for DOJ and FTC. Closely related to resources is how long it takes to get an antitrust case to trial. If it takes years to investigate and then years to get to trial, that's a lot of years the public is denied competition waiting for law enforcement. I know these cases can move faster because I've seen it done. Moving faster will conserve resources, boost agency staff morale. They don't sign up for this at below market wages for decades. And if you get a case to trial faster, you get the results for the public faster. The subcommittee should take immediate actions to increase funding for enforcement and to expedite antitrust cases in the courts. Number 2, you should consider stopping bad conduct before it happens. In a significant merger review, DOJ or the FTC is given a period of time to investigate before the merger is allowed to close. There is what's called a waiting period while DOJ or FTC investigate the merger. The ability to intervene and stop bad conduct before it happens, without the huge burden in the courts of obtaining a preliminary injunction, should be extended to monopoly conduct. I have a current example that I describe at length in the written testimony. Apple is about to introduce a new change to its App Store that threatens the free apps that millions of iPhone and iPad consumers currently are using. Apple will require, this is just a few weeks away, free apps to acquire user consent before passing valuable advertising data to advertisers, while Apple on its apps will be able to pass that information by default unless the users opt out. Apple will enforce the new opt-in rule by forcing free apps to display a scary, misleading pop-up about what free apps do with the data from a user's device. Apple will cut ad revenue to free apps while Apple protects itself. Free apps are either going to have to charge fees, they go from free to being paid for, or they're going to exit the market. Apple wins either way because it takes a big cut, 15 or 30% of all subscription fees. And it also offers its own free apps, like Apple News, that it wants to shield from competition with free rivals. Consumers will be the losers. They will get fewer, more expensive apps on the App Store. Third suggestion, you should take advantage, and you've heard other opening remarks on this, take advantage of the experience with other monopoly remedies. I represented pieces of the broken up Bell system, and I worked on issues coming out of the Bell breakup remedy. Parts of that remedy were very effective, other parts less so. In particular, as Ranking Member Buck mentioned in his opening, requiring portability of telephone numbers and interconnection between rival networks reduced entry barriers. By contrast, the line of business restrictions that are akin to a Glass-Steagall Act turned out to create a lot of administrative burdens and were more pure regulation, not resembling antitrust enforcement. Fourth suggestion, and that is that enforcement is most needed where monopolists are affirmatively disrupting rivals' independent efforts to compete. As I mentioned, there's an example brewing with Apple. The cases that have been filed by the Department of Justice against Google in the District of Columbia and by a 10-state group in Texas fit that paradigm. That's where Google is interfering with independent efforts by rivals to compete. Both of those cases are good under current law. You don't need to change the antitrust laws for those cases to go forward. We do need to do the work of enforcing the law and to do it quickly. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thorne. I now recognize Ms. Harper for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee and the full committee. Thank you for the opportunity to give this testimony. I appear before you today as someone who has devoted her career to figuring out how to broaden economic opportunity in this country. That pursuit has led me many places, the Federal Trade Commission, a corporate law firm, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I currently serve as the senior advisor at the American Economic Liberties Project, an antitrust advocacy organization which does not accept any money from corporations. What these experiences have shown is that until we address corporate power at its core, the rest of us are just playing for economic scraps. And currently, there is no greater power that threatens our livelihoods and civil liberties than the big tech platforms, namely Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. That fact is best put by none other than Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Quote, "In a lot of ways, Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company. We have this large community of people, and more than other technology companies, we're really setting policies." As the subcommittee's extraordinary 16th-month investigation and report revealed last year, big tech corporations have and abuse their extreme market power. It's impossible to include an exhaustive list of the harms this dominance causes because they are so large and so intertwined with much of our economic activity. Collectively, these firms control the financial lives of many American small business owners and workers. They enable the rampant spread of misinformation, which has compromised our elections and the safety of our schools, communities, and even members of Congress.
and they have almost entirely destroyed a core American institution of free and vibrant press in the form of local newspapers. And unlike what they would have us believe, the dominant tech firms did not achieve this market power through only superior business acumen. Rather, they exploited gaps in public policy, including the weakening of merger law and decades of lax monopolization enforcement, to build dominance by aggressively acquiring other businesses and employing anti-competitive tactics to squash competitors. This unquestionable dominance led the subcommittee to launch the most thorough investigation into monopoly power in 50 years, ultimately resulting in recommendations that make clear a traditional regulated competition approach, including structural separations, is necessary to rein in these corporations and restore freedom in the digital markets. The United States has a tradition dating back to the 1800s with the railroads of using a regulated competition approach to limit corporate power. And over the course of the 20th century, policymakers used laws, regulations, and antitrust suits to break up banks, television networks, and electric utilities. The result was the most robust economy in global history, with high wages, high technology, and high business formation. As the research of many economists has shown, there are several reasons to apply such an approach to the dominant big tech platforms. First, structural problems demand structural solutions. Conflicts of interest are baked into the platform's business models. The only way to address these conflicts is to limit their operation in certain markets. Second, regulatory tools alone cannot address the problem of entrenched market power and can sometimes make it worse. The dominant tech platforms know they offer critical infrastructure and can effectively ignore regulation, and we've seen this in the past. Finally, structural separations are also easier to administer. The platforms and their business practices change rapidly. Structural remedies offer an ex-ante way to address the root cause of a platform's dominance without costly and ultimately ineffective supervisory efforts. Some claim that breakups are unduly burdensome, but the evidence doesn't support that. In fact, there's reason to believe that breakups might be easier to accomplish with a tech platform than some other commodity-based industries. And let's keep in mind that corporations commonly initiate self-imposed breakups, otherwise known as restructurings, all the time. Digital platforms similarly will adjust with changed business models after structural separations. But that alone will not entirely tame the problem of dominance. Regulation will be needed. Dominant firms should have to give market players equal access to their platforms, and we must make changes to antitrust law to restore mid-20th century monopolization and anti-merger statutes. Breaking up firms is relatively useless if they can simply recombine. Facebook is taking out full-page ads in the New York Times inviting regulation because its executives know that the true threat to their business model is a breakup. When the Australian government moved forward with a regulation forcing them to compensate news outlets for their content, far from welcoming the measure with open arms, Facebook announced it would ban all news. They are retaliating to scare Australia and other governmental bodies like this Congress from imposing even more aggressive remedies. Only structural separation can limit their power to enable effective regulation. I encourage the subcommittee to continue reasserting your congressional authority and swiftly implement the report's recommendations. Under your leadership, Congress can restore the government's long legacy of standing up to corporate power that threatens our American way of life. It's time to break them up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harper. Thank you to all the witnesses for your opening statements. And we will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I'll begin by recognizing the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some have suggested that current law is enough to police anti-competitive practices in the digital economy and beyond. While I agree that the plain language and legislative history of the antitrust laws are an unambiguous prescription in favor of competition and against monopoly, and frankly, should be flexible enough for the modern economy, it is abundantly clear that they are not. That's because for decades, courts have strayed far from the intent and plain meaning of these laws, and enforcers under both Republican and Democratic administrations have not done nearly enough to curb the rise and abuse of online market power. Ms. Slaiman, do you agree that it is the constitutional responsibility of Congress, not the courts, agencies, or private corporations, to enact laws that reverse these trends?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's urgent that we do so as quickly as possible, because the longer that we are waiting, the more competition we are losing. Thank you for that great question, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Harper, isn't it true that the policies that are under discussion today, non-discrimination, interoperability, and structural separation are the same tools that Congress has employed for nearly a century to create competition in highly concentrated markets and to complement effective antitrust enforcement?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. That is absolutely right. And actually, the structural separation, regulated competition approach is in line with our American tradition of addressing corporate power when it has gone too far. And so in combination with regulations, once we've broken up these companies, they are able to actually regulate, we'll be able to bring competition back to the market and have room for small businesses, entrepreneurs, and ultimately workers to benefit as well.
Ms. Slaiman and Mr. Singer, what is your response to some of the arguments we've heard that the proposals you support would somehow harm smaller competitors, reinforce the market power of dominant firms, or harm consumers' privacy? Mr. Singer first.
I can take that one first. Well, it doesn't make sense, at least with respect to the non-discrimination regime. You couldn't be a respondent. No one could haul you in front of the tribunal unless you were determined to be a dominant platform. So that the notion that the non-discrimination regime, as I've contemplated it, would expose small merchants to liability is just a farce.
And Ms. Slaiman?
Thank you. So interoperability as a regulatory tool is really targeted at helping those smaller competitors to be able to get a foothold in the market. It's important that we are targeting the interoperability requirements. We don't need every single feature to be interoperable. We want to have some differentiation of products. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have an agency regulator that is making a lot of these detailed decisions about what type of interoperability is appropriate for different markets. But the whole goal is to support those small businesses and help them to thrive.
Now, in a written statement for today's hearing, Consumer Reports argues legislation to prohibit the abuse of gatekeeper power and lower barriers to entry online is essential to creating a marketplace that empowers consumers with choice and, quote, the ability to go elsewhere for a better deal, which means businesses have to be responsive to consumers' interests, close quote. Ms. Slaiman, can you explain why creating competition in this area is so important to creating a better internet, a stronger economy, and a healthier democracy?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So right now, we have a market structure with dominant digital platforms that tends towards monopoly. There are important incumbency advantages or barriers to entry that we think are protecting these gatekeepers in that important gatekeeper role. So that's what we're trying to address here with these new tools that could break open the gates so that there can really be competition in these incredibly important features of our lives. The way that we are finding information on the internet, information discovery, ought to be a place where there is a lot of innovation and competition. The way that we communicate with our friends, even businesses and municipalities are now using social networking to reach people. That needs to be a competitive place where consumers can have choice. So it's vitally important that we are adopting these new tools so that we can promote competition against these gatekeepers and really have some choice for people.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chairman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that you recognize Mr. Owens, and I will then go towards the end if that's okay.
The chair recognizes Mr. Owens for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member and the witnesses. First of all, I really do appreciate this bipartisan process you guys are going through here. This is just remarkable, exciting to me that we are looking at probably the greatest threat we have to our freedoms and in so many different ways. Anyway, I'm going to bring a little different context. I was for 10 years in the telecommunications field as a Nextel corporate account executive, Sprint corporate account executive, and my last one was Motorola national account executive. So I had a chance to see firsthand how portability and interoperability work. It was a time when going from Nextel to AT&T, the benefits of maybe a better price, better customer service, even a better experience was just not good enough if you had to lose your number and your contacts at the same time. When I look at interoperability, it's something we see very, very easy today. It's seamless communication. We see it every single day. We text from an Apple to an Android. We know the difference because if it's the same platform as blue, if it's not, it's green. And sometimes we might get a little irritated when our text pictures will not go through. But that's progress, because at least now we take for granted it all should do that. Imagine today in which Google data, Facebook data, are ours, not the corporations, seamless and interoperable, and able to be able to be seamless across the different platforms. Imagine a day where innovation, an innovator or startup, can actually compete and offer to pay for your data. I want to ask Mr. Thorne, your experience with Verizon over the years, in your experience, do you believe the data portability and interoperability requirements work? Can they promote competition, and would it be easy to administer?
Yes, and no. As someone remarked earlier, the details matter a lot. But it's like the question, do you believe in infant baptism? Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it happen. It does work. In the telephone network of the past, we were able to open up competition by defining relatively stable interfaces, and those were places where you had to connect to others. And small telephone networks were able to build up. The way the Bell system was first monopolizing, way back 100 years-ish ago, was AT&T would go into local competitive markets and say, this is the telephone company I will connect with. Your name can be Bell. You can be Illinois Bell, Chicago Telephone Company, right, this is where I grew up. Chicago Telephone Company, competing telephone company, we're not going to connect to you. So you want long distance access, Illinois Bell wins. Chicago Telephone Company is still engraved in a piece of stone over a bar on LaSalle Street. So they were picking and choosing by denying or granting interconnection who would win or lose. And conversely, it turns out to be a terrific remedy. But the details matter a lot. As you know, okay, do you charge for interconnection? The telephone companies had this idea that, okay, if you're going to terminate a call, you got to pay for termination. And then entities
Can you open up? Can you bring a little close to your microphone?
I'm sorry. Thank you. There were all sorts of additional details that mattered in making interconnection effective. It probably does require an agency to continue that enforcement. I'm not sure you need an agency to fix these problems, but that kind of remedy does work.
Okay. With what type of guardrails we'll be looking forward for this data portability and interoperability?
I frankly do not know enough about the details of what kinds of portability or interconnection would solve these particular problems. I just don't have enough information. That's going to be a hard engineering question for you to address.
Okay. Mr. Singer, would you like to add anything to his comments?
Just that I'm also a supporter of portability and interoperability mandates in this area. I've seen it work in mobile number portability, as you mentioned, and I have faith that it would also work here.
Thank you. I'll yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I really want to say thank you to the witnesses for the really excellent testimony. And Dr. Singer, I'd like to begin with you. I think there's consensus both in the majority report and in the report prepared by my Republican colleagues that self-preferencing is a problem with the dominant platforms. And in my opening question in the hearing to the Google CEO, I asked specifically about scraping content and discriminating against rivals and steering consumers to their own goods and services. And really would like you to sort of drill down a little bit more about how self-preferencing undermines competition, and then what a non-discrimination regime would look like in practice, like how that would work.
The way that it undermines competition, I refer to it as the towel drops. So an entrepreneur watches her idea get stolen and then watches the platform steer users to her idea and basically gives up, throws in the towel. And that's the harm that we're worried about. It's an innovation harm. And there have been studies that have documented what happens when affected sellers on Amazon's platform get their ideas stolen. They end up, selling fewer items on Amazon as a result. There's studies that show what happened to app developers on Google's app site, App Store, when they have their ideas stolen. And so it is well documented, the nature of the harm. How it would work is, I'm not doing anything very novel. I've litigated several cases in front of the FCC, Federal Communications Commission's administrative law judge, under Section 616 of the program carriage regime. And I think it works, and I think that the same sort of structure could be set up. We just need an ALJ and a conference room and a standard, and a victim of discrimination would come forward and have to prove that they're, three things. They're similarly situated to the app or merchandise of the platforms. Number two, that they've received disparate treatment or disfavored treatment as a result of their lack of affiliation, as opposed to some other legitimate business justification. And three, as a result of 1 and 2, they've suffered material injury. If you can show those things, you win under the FCC's tribunal, and you can get relief. The relief that you get is damages, lost profits, and you get injunctive relief as well. I would add a third component here, which is structural separation, as I mentioned in my opening remarks.
Great, thank you very much. Ms. Slaiman, one of the issues that I have been very concerned about is how ineffective enforcement policies can actually harm competition and consumers. And I first said this in the context of the FTCC settlement with Facebook following the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And I think there have been a number of examples in which, very significant fines have really done very little to change the behavior of companies and their kind of monopoly power. And so my question to you is it clear from this sort of history that these big fines these monetary penalties, even if they're in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, are really insufficient to stop these companies from engaging in the kind of conduct that harms competition and consumers and workers? And if so, what should we be thinking about, and how does this inform how we should be developing new legislative enforcement mechanisms sort of in light of this history and the size of these platforms and what seems to be sort of no financial penalty large enough to actually make a difference?
Yes, that's absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. I was disappointed to see that the focus of that result from the Cambridge Analytica investigation of Facebook was monetary. We really needed to see big changes to how Facebook was treating user data, and I didn't think we saw enough of that. So I think that's something to keep in mind going forward. You're absolutely right that monetary damages will usually be insufficient with these platforms, and we really need to be making changes to how they are operating the business and really changes to the structure of these markets is, I think, what interoperability can do. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add something to Mr. Singer's point in response to the last question about non-discrimination. I think there is an additional harm to the harm that he mentioned about competition on the platform. Platforms that are gatekeepers can actually also use discrimination as a tool to protect their gatekeeper power. It's not just about competition on the platform, but competition against the platform. One of the very few ways that smaller companies might try to compete against a gatekeeper platform is to start out selling a product on the platform or providing a service through the platform, and to expand or to disintermediate, building a direct relationship with consumers so that they no longer rely on that platform. If the platform has the power to intervene and discriminate against that potential competitor so early on in the process, they can prevent anyone from being able to compete against them at that gatekeeper platform level as well. So I think that's another important harm we should keep in mind with a non-discrimination rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Slaiman. I see that my time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Professor Lipsky, I have the benefit of being able to look up at the pictures on the wall and recognize all but 2 of them as people that I've known and served with. During that time, the last 20 years, what I've noticed is that corporations come to us regularly asking us to pick winners and losers. Some 20 years ago, Sun Microsystems sat at the chairs that others are sitting at today and told us about Microsoft as a monopoly with barriers to entry, particularly in Internet Explorer. a product that is very hard to find in use today. But at that time, it was dominant. And so I'm more reticent to automatically say that a company that has earned recently market power, great market power, is inherently going to be able to retain it, even if they use many of the techniques that have been talked about here today. But I do have a couple of areas I'd like to dwell on today that I think are tangential to this problem and could go a long way toward the United States leading the world in free, fairness, and opportunity for competition. One of them is back to that question of who owns the data and what we own. The European Union, famously, of course, has this right to be forgotten, meaning a right to put your information out there and then later have it stripped back. The United States has resisted that. But as many have talked about owning a phone number, would it be helpful if Congress, either directly or through an administrative process, began extensively defining that data which inherently does belong and can be made portable by the consumer?
Thank you for your question, Representative Issa. I think this is an area worth exploring. I'm the first to confess I don't know enough of the details about the significance of particular pieces of data, the privacy laws as they now exist, and what kind of administrative solutions are available. But I think in principle, I think there are a number of solutions like the cell number portability. And I also mentioned, just because it's part of my experience, things like denied boarding compensation or other sort of convenient rules that work to assist the consumer or the user in taking advantage of such competitive options as exist. So I would hesitate to endorse any particular approach or to get into the details, but I think among the recommendations made by the majority staff report and recommendations, this is one that probably deserves to be explored, not necessarily as a legislative or compulsory government exercise, but perhaps this is someplace where something like a standards development organization should be thought of. Give the private sector a chance to establish the basic principles, and then Congress can step in to the extent that the result is not satisfactory.
Thank you. Professor Thorne, carrying on with that, I'm going to use the example currently of Android products and Parler. When Apple threw Parler off of its site, even while it was the #1 selling item on its site, it denied it access because it's a closed system. In the case of an Android product, Parler was free to have a device or a app that they could put on their own site once they got a site back up that gave them an opportunity to go into the products. Should we, in products such as Apple and non-Apple phones, be looking at the real question of whether or not the consumer owns the right to put products onto theirs? In other words, can Apple continue to have a system that eliminates the ability of anyone to add something to their software, which of course, if our PCs were delivered with no ability to add another software package of any sort unless it came from the vendor, we would certainly call that an unlawful tie-in. So how would you feel about us having a role in that? And I'm using Apple as the example versus the Androids.
Apple and Android are both good examples of places where you've got a lot of market power. The defense, for example, you hear Apple say is, well, if a consumer doesn't like that I've disabled the apps that they were using, they'll just switch to the other platform. My phone costs about $1,000. I haven't paid it off yet. I'm not going to switch to another phone just because of an app choice. That's a kind of power similar to what the Supreme Court said is an antitrust case in the East Bend Kodak against Image Technical Services case. My view only, maybe. I think under existing law, there's an antitrust case that could remedy some of that stuff right now. And for example, what I described as Apple. Just one other point to follow up on your comparison to Europe. I think what Europe has done with privacy is a benchmark for what does or doesn't work. Under the GDPR privacy protections, the opt-in regime for apps produces about 95% of consumers opting in. What Apple is about to do to free apps, people expect maybe 20%. That's a signal that they're doing something different and bad.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you.
I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Chairman Nadler for holding this important hearing as we move to the next phase of the subcommittee's work examining the rise of market power online. I want to say thank you to Chairman Cicilline in particular for the comprehensive investigation that he helped this committee lead last Congress. As we learned from that investigation, our existing antitrust laws, competition policies, and current enforcement efforts are not adequate to address the growing market power and anti-competitive business practices of companies in the digital marketplace. And this hearing really offers an opportunity to reflect on the work that the subcommittee did during the last Congress, as well as reflect on the work left to do to ensure that our digital marketplace is fair for users, consumers, entrepreneurs, and small businesses. So I want to thank the witnesses for being here and for their testimony. I have a question around innovation, but before I get to that, I guess I just want to kind of make sure that I'm understanding the testimony of the witnesses. My understanding on interoperability is that, generally speaking, each of the witnesses supports us as a Congress exploring the potential ways in which we could perhaps ensure the interoperability is applied in the context of the digital marketplace and social media companies. I'll just go through each witness to just make sure if that's, if I've correctly stated your views. Ms. Slaiman, is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Singer?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Gundersen?
Yes, and the interoperability is not technically the hard part we should be discussing. What I'm sharing today is the problem with the
Agreed.
exclusion.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Professor Lipsky?
Yes.
And Mr. Thorne?
I have seen it work, and I subject to the details, I think it will work in new places.
Ms. Harper?
Yes, but also structural separations and other considerations, but yeah.
Thank you. So, and the reason I ask that is because this is a very complex topic, and obviously I'm supportive of any number of other reforms that we're exploring both as part of this hearing and will be exploring in the coming weeks and months. But it strikes me that given your testimony, the breadth of experience and shall we say, political ideological views of the witnesses that are gathered before our committee, all agreeing that we need to do something about interoperability, to me, suggests that this is an area ripe for the committee to immediately move on in a bipartisan fashion. And so I would just, I appreciate all of your candor with respect to answering that particular question. And I hope that we can, in short order, move on this particular issue. Now, innovation. Over the course of the subcommittee's investigation, we heard the same story from sellers, developers, entrepreneurs about big tech's impact on innovation. An individual comes up with a new idea, a product, does all the market research, starts selling the product on the platform, which opens it up, the data collection from the platform, becomes a bestseller, and then gets their idea taken from the platform and is driven out of business, creating what some people, venture capitalists, others have called an innovation kill zone at the platform's edges. Mr. Singer, in one of your publications in Pro Market, you say, and I have a quote here that, quote, if left unchecked, the resulting competitive landscape could become so inhospitable that independents might throw in the towel. I represent Boulder and Fort Collins, Colorado. They're two of the fastest growing, most innovative tech hubs in the country. So as you can imagine, very concerned about these types of tactics. And I guess I'd like to see if you might expound on what changes to federal antitrust law or to our regulatory regime Congress should consider to deal with this particular threat to innovation.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the change that I point out is that we need to create a venue in which a victim of discrimination, which typically falls on the heels of appropriation, can bring his or her complaint. Right now, the only venue for such a victim would be an antitrust court, which is inhospitable for the reasons I lay out in my piece. But in short, it takes too long, and I don't think the standard is right. So I think that if you want to stop this process, if you want to restore this pathway for entrepreneurship in America, we want to create a venue, and we want it to be fast, And we want the standard to be achievable by complainants who bring cases against dominant platforms there. And we want to give them relief, and relief quickly. So I think that's the best advice that I could give.
Thank you, Professor. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize, I don't believe the gentleman from Florida is present, correct? No, okay, I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, the distinguished Mr. Johnson.
I thank the distinguished chairman. I appreciate that very much. And I thank to all of our witnesses for sharing their time and expertise to us today. As you've seen, this really is a bipartisan concern and something we're all working on together, which is rare these days, and we're grateful. Real quick, Mr. Singer, I was just asked by our ranking member to follow up with you and ask, are you suggesting a CFPB kind of measure or creation of something like that?
No, I don't think a new agency is needed. I think that all we would need is I call it a tribunal, but really an administrative law judge. Just how the FCC has its own administrative law judge, the FTC has an administrative law judge. I think that this could just sit inside of an existing agency. I'm also sensitive to the notion of bureaucracy and agency and paper pushers and the like. I don't think that's needed. Whenever I argued a case in front of the FCC's tribunal, it was one ALJ and his legal assistant. That was it. So I think this could be done in a fairly streamlined fashion.
That's music to our ears. Mr. Thorne, like most members of this committee, I have deep concerns about this seemingly ever-expanding nature of big tech. We all do. And the residual effects of its expansion on other sectors of the economy and the workforce. And like you, I've litigated extensively in our courts, and I wanted to drill down on a few points you made in your written testimony pertaining to under-enforcement. You specifically note the difficulty and high cost of expert witnesses in litigation and comparatively low financial resources of enforcement bodies. Through the lens of your experience as a practitioner, could you expand upon how you see that lack of necessary resources as an issue that prohibits scrutiny of firms with potentially monopolistic features?
Thank you for that question in particular. The cases right now against Google are the hardest cases ever litigated in our courts. And the people that are carrying the water on that are great lawyers. The staff lawyers at DOJ, the staff lawyers at the Texas Attorney General's office and the other states that are in that case, are paid below market, but they are working above market. They do not have the same resources that their opponent has. And these are really, as I said, these are hard things. I just found it amusing. The Texas Attorney General went to his legislature and said, may I please have $43 million, not for lawyers, just for the expert witnesses. I'm in an expert witness bidding war against Google. I need $43 million. The answer from the finance chair of the Texas Senate was, I don't think that's going to be enough money for you. I don't think you can actually win this with that side. These are very difficult things. And if you want to do more than the one or two going on right now, if you think more enforcement actions, I think there are more enforcement actions that can be brought. If you want to do more than that, the agencies need funding now. And so I'd recommend the committee get a lot of interesting and hard things to work on and study, and maybe in this Congress you'll move something, but fund the agencies now. There's no reason to wait for that.
I appreciate that. It's a very practical concern and something we have to consider as we go forward in all this. I worked for a nonprofit litigation firm doing religious liberty work for 20 years, and we had the same disparity sometimes in what we were doing. And it ultimately has a great effect on the economy and consumers and all that. I guess we'd have to quantify exactly how much would be needed. I mean, the resources seem hard to calculate sometimes what's needed. Another question, you consistently touched upon the importance of a faster, more responsive enforcement process to promote competition and economic liberty. You talk about two specific reforms you've mentioned in the first recommendation and your justifications for them. If you just want to take, we got a minute or so left, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on what specifically you're suggesting in that arena.
So let me start with consumers. That's your constituency. Why are they waiting so long for good law enforcement to happen? I mean, there's a long period of investigation, and I'm not proposing that you interfere with the pace of investigations. They need to be thorough, and you've got to bring good cases. But once a case is brought, it does not have to take 5 years. Tad Lipsky, one of my friends, worked on the IBM case at the Justice Department when he was a baby lawyer, and that was about 13 years, and DOJ just dropped it. I mean, if the defendant can drag these things out long enough, the market will have moved past that. It won't matter anymore, but that's a long time for consumers. And then the other end of the spectrum, the individuals that sign up to do this stuff at the agencies, speaking for them for a sec, it's like you want to join the Army, the Marines, you know what the tour of duty is going to be. I've got a 8-year contract, but I'm going to be in for 2 years, or 4 years. They really do not sign up for an unending length of under market pay.
Thank you. Let me yield to Ms. Jordan.
I appreciate the 9 seconds. Thank you. So we're talking about bureaucracy. We're talking about dealing with these in a quicker fashion. So are you for Senator Lee's introduced the legislation, one agency to deal with this? So we got the FTC in the Justice Department. Do you support that concept, Mr. Thorne, or how should this work?
I've not seen his legislation. I apologize for that.
Okay. Well, all right.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Swalwell, the gentleman from California.
Thank you, and I want to thank Chairman Cicilline for elevating this issue. I represent a constituency in the San Francisco Bay Area with entrepreneurs who want to know that as they seek to have innovative solutions, that they're going to have a fair playing field, and I think this addresses that. First, my first question is for Ms. Slaiman, and I want to know how you would apply traditional antitrust law, what exists today, the goal of which is to protect consumers from high prices, to the subject of today's hearing, which is the power of gatekeepers online. Ms. Slaiman, do you think that there's room in existing law for courts to use existing antitrust law to protect consumers, or do we need changes to the law?
Thank you so much, Congressman. We absolutely do need changes to the law. I have very much appreciated the antitrust cases that have been brought already by the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, and state enforcers against Google and Facebook. And I think that those cases are doing a great job in the direction of trying to address this problem. But really, the problem is much broader than any particular antitrust violations that may have occurred. So even if those cases are very successful and we get really strong remedies out of them, I think we would still be left with this fundamental gatekeeper problem and the structure of the market that tends towards monopoly. So that's why it's so important to add on top these regulatory tools like interoperability and non-discrimination.
And even if current antitrust laws could address the monopolistic conduct of gatekeepers, and it sounds like your opinion is that it cannot, are they sufficiently fast enough and clear enough to deter that conduct in any meaningful way?
The length of time that it takes to do antitrust enforcement is also, I think, a real limitation. And that's something that other witnesses have talked about as well. We can work on trying to speed that up, but I do think that having ex-ante rules set in advance can save so much time and provide more certainty for businesses as they are deciding how to operate in the market, for them to know interoperability is going to be required or discrimination is not going to be allowed. That can really save a lot of litigation time and help those businesses.
Ms. Slaiman, I listened to your opening statement where you argue that we need new sector-specific laws. Since the beginning of antitrust policy, though, we've had broadly applicable laws which apply to every industry equally. So why does technology require its own laws? And if we do it that way, wouldn't every industry come up with its own complaints and want its own laws?
Well, many industries are already subject to pro-competition regulation. A lot of these ideas are inspired by the communications industry, where we have pro-competition regulation. I'm also thinking of the Cable Act, where we have pro-competition regulation. So although this is new, we want to learn the lessons from those other industries, but many industries are regulated for competition, and I think that is fully justified to do that here.
Great, thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman moves back. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Big tech, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others have been able to grow to dominate the marketplace because they are protected from liability under Section 230. If we don't aggressively address their liability protection, they will continue to grow and continue to dominate and push out competition. Even if you break them up and separate them like the majority contends using antitrust provisions, and they still have liability protection under Section 230, the same thing's going to happen because they're barred from being sued. If Twitter and Facebook can editorialize, censor, and edit content, then why should they be treated different than news networks and newspapers that do the same thing? I have a bill that very narrowly goes in and reforms Section 230. It doesn't do away with it. It's called the Kasich Act. It's H.R. 285. It provides a private right of cause of action for anybody that feels, or business that feels, that their rights under the First Amendment have been violated, and gives that private right of cause of action. I encourage any members of this committee that want to work on this issue. I'd be happy to work with any members on either side of the aisle. My first question is for Mr. Thorne. Big tech has discriminated against conservatives in a variety of ways, including deplatforming them, suspending accounts like they did to the former president, and other similar actions. What are practical ways to stop big tech censorship without creating obstacles for small startup companies?
So I am at a personal level concerned about that, and I didn't prepare to talk about that at this hearing, but I do think if we address the underlying problem of, pick on Google for example, if it is the gatekeeper to where you get the information, you get to the status of becoming a verb, if there was competition against Google, that would be a much less serious problem. But I think it's a serious problem.
And you've spoken about the financial obstacles in the antitrust cases. And in your written testimony, you mentioned how the state of Texas was afraid that it couldn't match a tech giant in a long, drawn-out litigation. Beyond better financing for DOJ or state legal efforts, what can be done consistent with free market principles to create a fair playing field in such a situation and actually combat antitrust when it occurs?
I actually think if we win these cases, we will have done an awful lot of good as a starting point. But there are more cases. I'm concerned about what Apple's about to do to free apps on its platform. There are more cases to be brought. These things take resources, and I've been as creative as I can be. But I think at the level of if you believe this is important, I mean, you believe the Constitution is important. I believe a market economy is important. There should be real enforcement here, and that takes resources. It is not something that self-polices. It requires vigilance, as my friend would say.
Well, can you talk further about the potential downsides of creating a new federal agency to address these issues?
Oh, so Bill Barr's favorite former Attorney General is Robert H. Jackson. Last week at Judge Merrick Garland's confirmation hearing, he brought up Robert H. Jackson as a model for enforcement. Robert H. Jackson convinced his president at the time to hold off on regulation. Let's not run the price in terms of how people operate. Let's try antitrust first. And I would recommend that. I mean, you should consider with the tools that Congress has, you should consider all the different things that make sense. But if antitrust works, you don't need to set up an agency that stays there forever.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all of my colleagues and all of our witnesses. I thoroughly enjoy the bipartisan nature of this hearing. I am excited to join this subcommittee at a time when it renews its effort to ensure that our economy and our democracy work for everyone. Mr. Lipsky, thank you for being here. I greatly appreciate your time, and I have a few questions for you, sir. You're the director of the Competition Advocacy Program at the Global Antitrust Institute of the Antonin Scalia Law School, correct?
Yes, although I'm appearing only in personal capacity, as I stated in my testimony.
Sure. In the fiscal year ending in June 19, your institute's budget was $2.1 million, correct?
Yep. I, as an adjunct professor, I am very minimally involved in anything administrative, and Lord protect me from having to deal with the budget.
Reclaiming my time.
I will
Okay.
have to
It is
circle
publicly
back, as they
available
say.
information. I appreciate your response, sir. Let me tell you why I asked. When I read that you were going to testify that we should do, from my perspective, relatively little to check the power of big tech companies, I was surprised, and I wanted to understand where you were coming from. So I followed the money, and I got the receipts. I have here copies of the invoices, checks, emails, and even thank you notes that reveal who funded your institute in the fiscal year ending in June 2019. Amazon gave your institute at least $175,000. Google gave at least $200,000. Qualcomm gave $964,600. And in total, over 60% of your institute's budget came from these three big tech companies alone. With all due respect, sir, if we'd wanted to hear the views of Amazon, Google, or Qualcomm, we would have invited them. When a CEO comes before this committee, I understand that they're going to advocate for their own interests. But when you come before us today, sir, when your institute is funded by secret donations from big tech companies, you today come as a wolf in sheep's clothing. And I would submit that the American people deserve to know the truth. The truth is that secret corporate funding like yours has distorted our discourse for far too long. For decades, institutes like yours have masked corporate money to protect monopoly power. Institutes like yours have worked to teach judges and regulators to let their guard down as corporate funders like yours came to dominate our economy. The American people, of course, are paying the price. The corporations who wrote your paychecks are now not only the gatekeepers for our economy, they're the gatekeepers for our democracy. And let me give you a few examples, one of which has been mentioned earlier today. When Tish James, the Attorney General from my home state of New York, stood up to protect New York workers from COVID-19, Amazon sued her to silence her investigation. When Barry Lynn, a scholar at the New America Foundation, had the courage to praise antitrust action against Google, Google's chairman got him fired. And when Facebook's own employees concluded that far-right conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones were violating Facebook's own rules against hateful and dangerous conduct, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who I confess grew up in my district, personally intervened to keep Jones on the platform. We cannot let corporations dictate the terms of our democracy any longer. Mr. Chairman, I ask that these documents be entered into the record with unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Bishop from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little mask malfunction right as I was trying to get my glasses off. You know, I confess this is maybe the most interesting hearing I've participated in. I'm a new member of Congress, a commercial litigator for 29 years. Never have gained any particular depth in antitrust law, and so it's intimidating. I've got some prepared questions here I'd probably get into, but one thing I think I'd like to do first, Professor Lipsky, I believe it was, I'd like to give you about a minute if you care to respond to what was just and the way in which you were impugned. I just think that would be fair.
I guess the not being knowledgeable of the matters that were discussed, I think it will be amply demonstrated by any review of my professional history that these views are fully consistent with what I've been articulating in terms of antitrust policy and antitrust enforcement since well before any of these digital technology companies even existed. And in particular, I'll take advantage of Mr. Thorne's reference to the fact that I worked on the IBM case, the United States versus IBM, which was the massive monopolization case filed by the Antitrust Division in 1969, which was dismissed 13 years later in 1982 without prejudice because the purpose of the case was essentially moot given the profound changes in the computer industry that occurred during that time. And my point is simply that I was not one of the litigators on that case. I was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General assigned to review that, to help and organize a review of that case because it had bogged down, it had become incoherent, it had begun to pursue very anti-consumer purposes.
Professor Lipsky, I'm sorry, I want to reclaim my time. I wanted to give you a moment to address that, but I need to save some time for some other things. Let me ask quickly, Ms. Slaiman, public knowledge, you're, I guess, a Democrat witness here today. Has your organization received money from Google?
Yes, we have.
All right, thank you. Let me ask this. The other thing that really impressed me, Mr. Thorne, the very beginning of your paper where you said in 1997, you're talking about a rocket docket antitrust case, you spent $24 million preparing it. The same case today would cost $54 million. You've talked about resources. In my commercial litigation career, I spent all my time litigating against bigger, well-resourced opponents and had a good bit of success. Is it possible that there's change to the process or change to the law that could result not only in solving some of the market problems that have been talked about by majority and minority, but also could make bringing the litigation more efficient? Or is it just the necessity of procuring the knowledge of the expert and devising perhaps a course of action to take? What is it that causes that to cost $54 million?
I think it's a resounding yes that things can go faster. Tad Lipsky just said the department just spent 13 years litigating against IBM. The Cravath firm, the Slaiman Moore, a fantastic law firm, was the defendant firm there. And they fought hard and well, and 13 years later, the government dropped the case. I had that same law firm on the other side of this case in the Rocket docket, and we got it to trial in 13 months. It is possible if you focus on expedition. I had a couple of small ideas in my testimony. I'm sure there are better ones, but a place I was recently in that's faster is the United States International Trade Commission. They've got a mission to stop the import of infringing products. And you get there, you don't spend weeks talking about the protective order. Here's the protective order, we're going. And your discovery is due in two months. I mean, it's boom, 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 and you have a trial. And
so I obviously understand as a litigator that the longer you take in litigation, the more the costs go up.
Oh.
But is that the predominant source of the cost? Is that it gets stretched out over time? Or is it the need to develop some sort of high-tech expertise to figure out what's going to be done? What are the problems? How does interoperability work, or whatever the...
It's obvious, in an antitrust case like any other piece of litigation, you've got to eventually simplify it so that the trier of fact can understand it, make a decision.
Right.
But you hire experts in the area. Lawyers don't know much about any particular subject when they start. But hiring experts, getting discovery done, getting to trial, that can be done in a compressed period. It does not take a decade.
Thanks, sir. My time's expired.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I wanted to go to Ms. Slaiman, if I could. Tell us in practice what would be required of the big companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook to make their dominant products and services interoperable. In other words, to deal with the anti-competitive effects of there being both a gatekeeper and a participant in the particular market traffic that they govern.
Thank you, Congressman. So I think the simplest example is with Facebook, so we'll start there. We're asking that they provide interoperability to competitors to the network. So that could be through an application programming interface, an API. Basically, they need to change some code in their system to make it available to competitors. And when they make updates to important features, they need to give some notice of those changes so that the competitors have a chance to make sure that their products will continue to interoperate even after the changes. So it's a lot simpler than historically the types of interoperability that we needed with the telephone network, where they had to invent new jacks and deal with physical networks. So this is a software problem, and they need to change that software and make it available to competitors.
Okay, so you're telling us that relatively simple technical fixes at Facebook, at Google, at Amazon could actually dramatically promote new commercial dynamics that would allow smaller businesses to be in the field and to prevent these anti-competitive effects. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It will also be important to have strong law enforcement capabilities on the side of the government to make sure that the interoperability is actually functioning properly. But yes, that's what we need from the company.
Okay, and none of this would destroy Facebook or Amazon or Google, the big companies, right?
No, it would certainly not destroy the companies. I do think it would have a real strong competitive impact. They would suddenly face competitive threats from places they haven't before. And I hope that would change the way that they're operating their businesses, but certainly would not destroy the companies. That's not our goal.
Go back to the analogy that you guys were using about telephones. Interoperability means that somebody who's got AT&T as their provider can call somebody who's got Sprint. Was that as a result of public regulation?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and so, and that didn't cost very much to guarantee interoperability, and we all now take it for granted as part of using the telephone. So you're saying we can institute features like that in order to promote entrepreneurship and real commercial entry for businesses right now that are suffering because some of their competitors are also the gatekeepers to their ability to compete effectively. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
Well, what's keeping us from doing this?
That's a good question, Congressman. You know, there are important details that I think need to be worked out, and that's where I think an agency regulator comes in. I want to defend the paper pushers who were criticized earlier. I think there is a really important role for regulators here to figure out, especially in such a technical space, exactly which features need to be interoperable. There are already great written works about this. You know, some of the data that we know is really important to be interoperable is the friends list or the social graph, tools like cross-posting. So there is a lot that is already known and that we can know now, but agency regulators can really make those decisions most efficiently.
Mr. Singer, you proposed a hybrid approach for us to consider empowering some kind of agency or tribunal to provide relief against structural discrimination on a case-by-case basis. I wanted to just take one example relating to Amazon to see how this might work. A study by Upstream Commerce found that 857 apparel items were first offered for sale by Marketplace. And within 12 weeks, Amazon began directly selling 25% of these top-selling items itself. In other words, it had sort of captured the ideas from these sellers, and in a quarter of the cases was selling basically the exact same item or some kind of mirror of the item. Given the fact that Amazon has been able to pressure companies like Nike with contract provisions, it's unlikely that small independent sellers could rock the boat to bring claims on their own behalf. So how would the kind of tribunal you're talking about help small sellers in this kind of situation?
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness may, of course, answer the question.
Thank you. Yes, to make it clear, I get phone calls, and a recent phone call came from a merchant on Amazon who said that he had been buried in search because Amazon was not showing his product on a standalone basis, but instead was bundled with a bunch of peripherals that caused the price of his product to appear high and therefore low in search. And he said, Hal, you know, what can I do about this? And I said, I'm going to go to Congress and tell them to create a venue for you so that you can bring a discrimination case. Because right now, the only other alternative is to go to an antitrust court. And I don't have the heart to tell him such a thing because I know what that would entail. That would entail years of his life, and he doesn't have that. He needs an intervention soon.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Fishbach, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Thorne, you submitted quite extensive written testimony, and I'm just regarding competition and increasing enforcement. I just wanted to provide you an opportunity to provide more information or recommendations based on that testimony if there's something that you feel would be helpful.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry the testimony is so long. If I'd known about the hearing earlier, it would have been shorter and clearer. But the longish piece at the end focuses on a simple idea of what do we want the antitrust laws to do. Now, regulators can do new things. The FCC, for example, in the telephone world can require sharing of stuff that goes beyond what the antitrust laws require. The question at the end is, do you want to focus on interference with independent activity rivals? And I think that's what the antitrust laws are focused on. Or do you want to just say monopolies are wrong, we're going to make them illegal? You get over 50% market share or some way, you can't have that anymore. You have to now compete differently. Our law has not said that monopolies should stop trying hard to win customers. If I'm successful because I built a good product, and I want to give you a price cut, more people benefit by definition because the monopoly's got more customers and there's less discipline. I would welcome a monopoly that gave you a price cut. I would welcome a monopoly that kept up its facilities better and kept investing in stuff. But there's a fundamental question, but on the other hand, I'll point to my friend, now Justice Gorsuch. He has a decision when he was a judge in the 10th Circuit called Novell. People point to that as strict, but it has a catalog of ways you can interfere with rivals' independent competition and be condemned under the antitrust laws and suffer the severest of consequences. And one of the cases he cites is a case called Conwood involving shelf space in physical retail stores. And I think it's a pretty good analog for a way that the antitrust laws can be enforced on the internet where the shelf space is virtual, not in a retail store.
Thank you. And I just thought with my last couple of minutes here, if Mr. Lipsky has anything else he would like to add, I know he's been cut off a couple of times. And so if there's anything to add, I would yield my time to Mr. Lipsky.
I'm very, very grateful for that. I guess I would just take advantage to say that a lot of regulatory solutions don't work out for a wide variety of reasons, and ask that as the committee explores these suggestions, that it make itself acutely aware of the history of sectoral regulation in, for example, the railroad and other surface transportation sectors, or in air transportation, and so on and so forth. We had for over 100 years the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was really judged, despite very good intentions when it was created in 1887, ended up being a very anti-consumer and innovation suppressing entity, and Congress wisely abolished the ICC in 1995. Same thing with the Civil Aeronautics Board in 1985. So we can't compare imperfect antitrust to perfect regulation, because perfect regulation simply doesn't exist. Thank you very much.
Would the gentlelady yield, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, yes.
Mr. Buck is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Lipsky, I want to ask you a few quick questions, if I may. There was an accusation made earlier that your testimony in some way may be altered by some of the donors to a foundation that you are associated with. Were you involved in the solicitation of those donations in any way?
No.
Did you have conversations with anyone at any point in time that would influence your testimony today?
No.
And when I say anyone, I mean specifically any representative from those companies.
Yes, I should say, just for absolute clarity and full disclosure, that I have attended a technical briefing about how the Google, some of the Google functions work, but that would be the entirety of my response.
Is your testimony today consistent with your views and writings from the past?
Absolutely.
And is there in any way an influence from donations that you did not know about on your testimony today?
No.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Thank my good friend and colleague, distinguished chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee, for yielding and for your leadership, as well as all of the witnesses for the testimony that you've provided today. Mr. Singer, during the inaugural days of the internet, is it fair to say that Congress took the position that a hands-off approach would allow this new platform to grow and flourish and innovation to be unleashed on that particular platform?
Yes, that's fair.
And in the early days, do you think that that decision has allowed for and facilitated sort of what we've seen in the decades that have followed in terms of the innovation economy?
Yes, I think that the dominant platforms today have been able to exploit certain gaps in protection that came about for different reasons, but including the fact that when they were a nascent industry 20, 30 years ago, there's no need for such regulation.
Is it fair to say that, in the view of some, sort of this Wild West approach, that it may have had some rational justification in the early days of this new platform without concentrated market power, adversely impacts consumers decades later?
Yes, and there has been a change in circumstances that would warrant a change in the regulatory treatment.
And part of that change in circumstance that would warrant the change in regulatory treatment is the growth and concentration of market power amongst a relatively handful of internet companies. Is that correct?
Yes, just a handful of companies have embarked on a series of hundreds of acquisitions that have eliminated what could have been threats to their platform power.
And how would your non-discrimination proposal that, as I understand it, would restrict self-preferencing and economic discrimination benefit the consumer in this new environment?
Well, the way that it would benefit consumers is to the extent that this appropriation of ideas and self-preferencing goes unpoliced, as it is today. We will see fewer and fewer innovations that occur that are pro-consumer in the edge of the network. And so while you might not be able to see a price effect in the short run from such discrimination, my opinion is that there are consumer harms that flow from this withdrawal of entrepreneurs in the edge who believe that the playing field is so stacked against them that it's not worth the effort and investments to try to take on one of these behemoths.
Now, the committee's report found that Amazon uses access to sensitive third-party seller data to then clone products and undermine those sellers who were on Amazon's e-commerce site. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how would a non-discrimination proposal address that type of conduct?
The non-discrimination proposal doesn't stop the cloning per se. In other words, it would allow the platform to continue to have a toe in the water. The way that it would stop it is indirectly by preventing the platform from monetizing the clone. In other words, if all Amazon did was make its own tripod, for example, but it didn't then use the platform power to steer users to the cloned tripod, right? It's the steering that comes on the heels of the cloning that creates the monetization, the profitability of the anti-competitive strategy. And so what the non-discrimination regime would do, I'm just repeating myself, is it would stop that second part. It would allow the platform to have a toe in the water, but it wouldn't allow the platform to leverage its power in such a way as to give its content affiliate an unfair advantage.
Thank you. And Mr. Gundersen, you are the co-founder and CEO of a mapping and location company called Mapbox. Is that correct?
Correct.
And in your testimony, I think you referenced the provision in Google's terms of service that require a developer to use Google search on the map rather than a map from another company. Is that right?
Correct.
And how does a restriction like this impact your business?
Congressman, that's a great question. Point being, the technical interoperability is already there. Where our customers are being restricted is if you want to use Google search on top of Google Map, that's the only thing that's allowed. If you want to use Google search along with the Mapbox map, it's not allowed. So you have to stop using our services, and developers must switch back. And Google is actively targeting and enforcing them.
Well, thank you for your presence here today, and I thank
Congressman, could I also
The time of the
respond?
gentleman has expired. Thank you.
Okay.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Thorne, does big tech discriminate against conservatives?
I have not studied that issue, but as a conservative myself, I've seen evidence for that.
Yeah, when they let the Ayatollah play, his tweets get to stay on the platforms, even when he's talking about striking a blow against America, but they deplatform, get rid of, ban the former president of the United States. I think that's discrimination. Would you agree?
I think that's a a form of editorial choice that in a competitive world would be disciplined by the consumers, and that's what I would be working on here.
Okay. Are big tech companies too big?
I don't know how to define too big, but I do know when somebody's interfering with independent business conduct, and that should be stopped.
92% of search is, Google has 92% of search. Is that too big?
They have monopoly power in search.
Yeah. And because they have monopoly power, should they be broken up?
Probably not the right time to talk about remedies, but as I read the...
What do you mean? That's what this whole committee is
No,
about.
as I read the United States case against...
But you heard the chairman's opening statement. He's talking about censoring more speech. He's talking about all kinds of things. You don't think it's the right time to talk about it?
I think if the United States wins its case in the District of Columbia based on the search monopoly, a proper remedy would be to break up Google. And I would not feel squeamish about that, and I don't think DOJ would feel squeamish.
So you're waiting for the case?
Waiting is a problematic term, because I'm impatient.
Yeah, I think we all are. I think the American people are. If they should be broken up, or waiting for the case, I get that. If they should be broken up, is current law sufficient?
Current law is...
Notwithstanding the time frame that we all have concerns about, Mr. Singers has
yes,
concerns.
current law is wonderfully plastic in the hands of a district court that's heard a violation of the antitrust laws and is charged with restoring competition. What does that take? In Standard Oil, it required breaking up the company, creating competitors, Standard Oil of Indiana, Standard Oil of Illinois, Standard Oil of Ohio, Standard Oil of California, and they immediately went to other territories. They competed against each other. The baby bells for the right kinds of competitive services like wireless immediately competed against each other.
Yes, you've given two examples, Standard Oil and the Bell, the baby bells, as you indicate. That's where you think this ultimately should end?
I think
is that what you're saying?
You asked, would this be working remedies? And again, my answer is I've seen it done.
Yeah. Okay. And
you have to go now, or in like 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Could everybody please mute yourselves? Thank you. Go ahead. Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If in fact they're broken up, it seems to me we would still need the overhaul of 230, because there's nothing to prohibit platforms from engaging the same kind of behavior we see now with discriminatory action against conservatives.
This is on my part speculative, but if you broke up, say, a Google, and now you've got competing search engines.
You got three or four Googles now.
I'm gonna use the one that gives me search results that are useful to me, and if they're discriminating in the search results against people that I want to see their information, I'm not going to use that, and consumers are going to discipline that.
No, I agree. That's the marketplace. That's what we want. But what I've witnessed here in the last several months is every big platform working at the same time to ban people from their platform, specifically the former president of the United States. So they all kind of colluded and band together to keep the president off. Will we have that same dynamic? And if we do, why not have 230, which says if you're going to moderate content, you don't get liability protection? Why not put that in place? And frankly, why not put it in place now?
Again, I'm not well enough prepared on Section 230. I read Justice Thomas's, was it a decision in a cert petition that wasn't granted, where he would read Section 230 in a very different way than it's being applied to the courts now. The earliest 230 decisions seem to have taken a different view than they might today.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for the purpose of questioning for 5 minutes. I want to take this discussion in a slightly different direction, and that is to explore the nexus between inequality and antitrust law. There may be some out there who are watching this who aren't as expert as our expert witnesses today, who aren't sure that consolidation of corporate power actually affects them, but in fact it does in multiple ways. You're not able to access the same independent news sources anymore because of Google's dominance over ad revenue. You're paying far more for your milk because of corporate consolidation. And all of the things that you buy online reel you in to that platform called Amazon, where its gatekeeper power controls everything that you see and buy. The reality is that inequality is skyrocketing, and the COVID-19 pandemic has made it worse. According to a recent report by Americans for Tax Fairness and the Institute for Policy Studies, the collective wealth of America's 651 billionaires has jumped by over $1 trillion since roughly the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, even as 1 million new unemployment claims are being filed every week. Meanwhile, big tech firms like Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple have made a killing during this pandemic, enjoying expanded and concentrated control over vast swaths of our economy, and often engaging in exclusionary conduct that erodes the bargaining power of workers and suppliers. So, Mr. Singer, do you think that big tech and other large corporations help exacerbate inequality in our society? And if so, why? What's the relationship there?
So yes, I do think they exacerbate inequality, and the way they do it is because they have buying power over two important groups. One are their workers, so their workers are not getting paid their marginal revenue products, a fancy word for saying what their contribution is at the margin to the firm in terms of revenues. And similarly, the input providers, the merchants, for example, who are supplying Amazon with inputs are being exposed to excessive take rates. That is, the tax that Amazon imposes on these merchants is too high. And the effect of those two sorts of strategies is to skew income unfairly in the direction of the platform owner. So I've written a piece recently, I think in the American Prospect, where I explain that if you go back to the original mission of antitrust, which should be about dispersing concentrations of power, we could use antitrust in a way to attack inequities, including racial inequities.
Thank you, Mr. Singer. Ms. Harper, what role should antitrust law play in addressing the harms posed by increasing corporate consolidation and decreased bargaining power for workers and small businesses?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. There is a very large role to play for a few different types of interventions to address this concentration issue. And I want us to focus on the real problem here. The problem is their power. It's the gatekeeping power that allows them to manipulate their users, profit off of data, and squash competition. And the only way that we will be able to stop that is not through individual regulations like interoperability or non-discrimination or individual enforcement actions. It is through breaking up these companies, addressing the inherent conflicts of interest in their business model that create these incentives. And when we do that, we can begin to actually eliminate some of the very urgent harms that you're pointing to that are happening right now, exacerbating inequality, lower wages for workers, pretty much non-existent bargaining rights when you're up against a giant and trying to negotiate. And so that's why we really encourage the subcommittee to move quite expeditiously to implement the solutions that are going to address the structural issues with these companies so that we can restore competition to the market and give workers, small businesses, entrepreneurs a chance to earn a livelihood free of fear.
Thank you, Ms. Harper. Very powerful. You paint a stark picture, I think, in which the economic power of these big tech firms has turned into political power that allows them to rewrite the rules of our society. And I think even just looking at what happened recently with Facebook in Australia shows the incredible power that these tech companies have. Antitrust laws and regulations should not just tinker around the edges of corporate abuse. They have to get to the heart, I think this is what you were getting at, the heart of unaccountable concentrations of power, and fundamentally safeguard the public trust. With that, I yield back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Spartz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great conversation, and I appreciate that we can have conversation and agree on some issues in this committee on both sides of the aisle, so I appreciate it. I work at some monopoly problem is becoming a bigger problem in a variety of industries. I work on healthcare reform in the state of Indiana, and there is a huge monopoly, oligopoly problem. And I'm struggling a little bit because I'm a huge believer as a free enterprise Republican and the freedoms of contracts. And I'm a huge believer that we don't want to go too much and try to regulate markets. But looking at a lot of contracts in healthcare, I've noticed enormous distortion of power of larger companies where some of these contracts or terms of service would have never been agreed by either side, but you have no choice. So what I'd like to get, and maybe I can start with Mr. Thorne, how would you give me an examples? Because I spend a lot of time reading contracts in healthcare when we work on the reform, but I would like to get your examples of some of the really egregious contract terms for consumer or business to business, and some of these contracts that really create enormous amount of distortion that we really should maybe take a deeper dive at.
So I have not taken discovery of any of the platforms that are being discussed here. And you often see stuff in their documents that are revealing. But I've seen the public documents involving Google's conduct. And I'll give you an example. They require in their standard contract that if you have a dispute with Google, it's got to be heard in California. So all of the early lawsuits against Google are filed in California. That's their forum selection clause. California has great courts, great judges. They're overworked. They got too many cases, and it's one of the slowest dockets in the country. But Google has arranged things so that when the state of Texas and a group of other states join together to file a case in Texas, which is a fast court, it's a rocket docket. Google says, no, we got all these other cases in California, come on over, our contracts require it. And moving state enforcement from a fast forum to a slow forum. That's an example of one of their contracts. The kinds of contracts that are problematic in antitrust cases are ones that create tying or exclusive dealing or interfere with somebody who's trying to sell a competing product.
But maybe Mr. Singer, you can add a little bit. And is there anything in the current law that could be improved? There is a better, when they go, there is a better recourse for someone, either it's individual, consumer, or the business, to be able, if you go in the civil court of law and actually be able to make your case, that it makes it easier, that the level of discovery and expenditures that, could be so significant that you would not be able even to deal with that. Is there something in the current law need to be improved if you have some examples?
Right, so let me try to identify, I think I know one contract provision that needs to go right now, and that's the Amazon imposes in its merchant contracts provisions by which the merchant has to waive its legal rights to, say, for example, join a class action. And the reason why this is so destructive is that, as Mr. Thorne noted, to bring an antitrust case against Amazon by yourself, you'd have to hire a fancy antitrust lawyer, and you'd have to hire a fancy antitrust economist, and just the scale doesn't make sense to bring these claims individually. And so the system is rigged effectively to immunize Amazon from antitrust scrutiny, at least by private complainants.
Does it have some due process? It doesn't allow any due process. So
mandatory. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So what does it require?
Yeah, it's not due process. It's mandatory arbitration. So they basically say that you can't bring a claim collectively as a class action, say, of other merchants who are similarly situated, but instead you have to submit to our arbitration process. And this kind of binding arbitration, mandatory arbitration provision should be scrutinized, and I would submit, should be nullified by an act of Congress so as to restore.
It depends how it's structured. It could be useful process for consumer too and more cost effective. It depends. I didn't, but any other size, or maybe, I don't know if Mr. Lipsky, you have some suggestions on this panel of any particular clauses that really give you a headache when you look at that, because we want to have a freedom of contract, but there are just some clauses I've read in some of the contracts when I dealt with healthcare that were really outrageous. Anyone on the panel would like to add anything to that?
Congresswoman, I'm happy to add something there, if I may.
Yes.
Yeah, so what I would emphasize is you're exactly right. What you're observing and your confusion in the healthcare space is that it is not fair, right? So you're not out of bounds there. And imagine what concentration issues and power issues we're seeing in that space and put it in overdrive in what we're seeing in the context of big tech. So that's why we really need to be realistic about what's possible now to even contract for, right? If you're a small business, a medium-sized business, an entrepreneur that's trying to play in these same markets, it's not possible. We have to structurally separate and change these companies and then begin to think about some of the additional regulations and changes to enforcement procedure.
Questioning for 5 minutes. Let me first say thank you all to our witnesses for being with us today. This has been a very important discussion. We've heard a quote this morning from Bishop Desmond Tutu. Mr. Thorne, I believe you quoted him. And when I think about him and what he stood for, I think we would probably all do a better job if we chose to live by the principles of Bishop Desmond Tutu. He also said this. He said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. He went on to say, if an elephant, this should make it plain for all of us, has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So think about that, but also think about what if you helped the elephant in that situation? And I would believe that we're all here today to create a more fair and equitable society, regardless of the business that we're in. To me, I was a former law enforcement officer, so to me, it's very simple. We have good actors and we have bad actors. And I am convinced that Congress has a direct responsibility to take action to right the wrongs, to, as we've heard this morning, to broaden economic opportunity in this land of opportunity and promote innovation. Promote innovation, not destroy it. So if we just think along those lines, I think we could all be on the same sheet of music, at least that we have some major issues in this area and we need to solve them. Ms. Harper, you said that Facebook and other platforms are not just corporations, that they seek to censor and destroy. Ms. Harper, could you just tell me a little bit, what do you mean by they're not just corporations?
Well, at this point, taking the example, and thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and your remarks. At this point, we're looking at an entity that is not just doing one thing, right? It has dominance in the social network space. It's also in a duopoly in the ad business, right? And so it's able to drive users in a certain way and create this addictive business model that just makes them a lot of money, but is actually causing our society a lot of harms. And so, that's what we mean. And just to give an example of how that power can play out, it's something that's come up before and I mentioned in my remarks, but look at Australia, for example, right? When Australia, a sovereign state, attempts to impose regulations to support the existence of news in their country, Facebook's reaction is not to, oh, let's just sit down and talk about that. It's to pull news, right? And so that is an example where in Australia has no recourse. So they can't just go to some of these other platforms that maybe are more focused on social media exclusively, like Clubhouse, for example, or TikTok. There are no substitute. Facebook is dominant. It has too much power. It knows it. And that's why it engages in these retaliatory acts.
Ms. Harper, thank you so very much. Mr. Singer, you talked about, we're trying to find solutions, and you said we don't need to create another department, but perhaps appointing an administrative law judge would create that much needed venue. Could you talk just a little bit more about how do we make that happen and kind of what are the pros and cons of that as opposed to?
Sure. I think the natural place to house this tribunal, or as I affectionately refer to it as the Net Tribunal, would be in the Federal Trade Commission. But with one caveat, I wouldn't want decisions made by the ALJ there to be subject to review by the 5 FTC commissioners. If I could point out one flaw in the design of the tribunal that works to adjudicate discrimination complaints at the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, it's that the decisions there by the ALJ are appealable to the full FCC. And in every instance, you had partisanship dictating votes. In other words, Republicans voted to overturn every finding of discrimination that has ever come up through this tribunal. And what hurts me about that is that you have a very pristine process that's based on the merits of the case and a neutral arbitrator, and it should end there. Now, I'm open to the idea of appeals, but I want to immunize this process from any politicization. And so I would submit that if you do house this in the FTC, that the appeals would go straight to the DC Circuit and would skip over the FTC commissioners.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singer, and again, thank you to our witnesses. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the mid-'70s, I had a record player, and then years after that, it became a cassette player, and then I had 8 tracks. My mom and dad had 8 tracks, and then eventually I have like 2,500 CDs right now at home. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. My point is that you know, government doesn't move at the same speed as technology. Technology moves much quicker than all of us, and all of those recordings are right here on iTunes right now. So my point would be 230 has to be changed because it's the only overarching remedy, I think, compared to us, even when you take a look at maybe breaking these up. And Mr. Thorne, before you talked a little bit about, and again, I'm old enough to remember the breakup of Ma Bell. And, you know, there was some criticism later on because what you saw is some of those players started to grow even larger and at a more rapid pace, like AT&T. So my question would be, how do we make that decision? And I know this has come up earlier. How do we make that decision that this is too big and this entity is not? And as technology advances, you know, that's going to be a moving target, and I'm frustrated by that. So
your description is so correct, and Bell System is an example of it. In the middle of the breakup, there was this thing called wireless service, and I think it was the CEO of AT&T on some stage talking to investors about this going to work, and it's a question: where's the wireless business going to go? And he turns to a lawyer and says, "Well, where's wireless business go?" Looks like a local service. The lawyer says, "Local service." It goes to the baby bells. You think of the biggest, most valuable part of the business, you know, without being thoughtful, because they didn't realize how important that was going to be. It is very hard for anybody to make good decisions about technology futures. I actually have more confidence in the Article III judiciary and in quick processes than I do setting up a permanent regulator. But one advantage a regulator has is they can readjust things. So if you make a mistake, the regulator can notice it. And again, I'm not praising anybody in particular, but regulators have the ability to revisit things in ways that maybe courts don't. So for some purposes, those may be a better form. By the way, appointments clause, don't enact something that makes unreviewable action a small thing.
thank you, Madam Chair. I would yield back to Mr. Bishop to balance.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Singer, I was listening with interest. If I get the drift, and I've already said my knowledge of this is pretty superficial at the moment, but it seems that I get the drift today. It's that you propose, and maybe on the left they propose, you know, breaking things up, non-discrimination regimes. Whereas, if I understood the thrust from Mr. Thorne and some others, and maybe Mr. Buck, the notion is, well, let's try interoperability and portability. I share some concern that others have about whether you may be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, or whether there could be undesirable collateral damage, reducing competition, reducing benefit to consumers by going too far. Wouldn't it be the logical thing to do to start with the remedies that there's consensus about, and then see if they're sufficient, and if not, go further?
Sure, but I feel like we've heard a clear consensus on the interoperability today, but I also think that we have consensus around non-discrimination too. I think I heard that from Public Knowledge's witness. Well, we could ask Mr. Thorne how he feels about non-discrimination. So I feel that it makes sense to start where there's consensus, yes. Now, of course, I do recall, I do build in structural separation as a remedy in the non-discrimination regime is contemplated, right? If you have a recidivist discriminator who's just flouting the law and it keeps getting hauled over and over and over again in front of this tribunal, I think that at that point, the tribunal should have the power to impose structural separation as a remedy.
All right. Mr. Thorne, two things, maybe a little comment on that same question. Do I have the drift right? Because I heard in your testimony, in response to Mr. Jordan's questions, you said, with respect to Google, monopolist, if, you know, maybe the remedy would be to split them up. So you haven't really ruled that out either. What about that? And what do you think about the alternative forum idea, you know, that in the FTC that Mr. Singer spoke of?
You know, the details matter so very much that it could be a good idea, and I don't want to naysay it yet, but just adding more people under a nebulous standard, you know, we want to stop discrimination, that's not specific enough. Discrimination is really, really important in a handful of antitrust cases imposing liability on monopolists. It was never the end of the inquiry. It was a signal that something's wrong, And it turns out to be an easier remedy for an antitrust court to say, stop discriminating, than to set new terms of dealing, like some judge setting price in terms of dealing. So, but it was never the end of the inquiry. There was always a chance for the monopolist to say, no, I had a reason for that. And hear it out, and if it's a real reason, they get away.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline. Well, as this committee's investigation has revealed, big tech has relied on creating barriers to entry as a means of building up and maintaining monopolies. Whether it's Apple making arbitrary rules for direct competitors to use their app store, or Amazon using a vendor's own sales information to undercut their business. It appears that the time has come when Congress has to take action. So I'm particularly concerned about the impact of gatekeeper techniques on user privacy, and so are my constituents. So I'd like to focus my questions on the network effects of Facebook and Google, because those platforms are so dominant. That's where so many of my constituents really encounter privacy concerns. The self-reinforcing nature of those companies makes it difficult for users to leave when they've been harmed, and makes it hard for emerging companies to draw new users onto their platforms. And what we've seen is that Facebook and Google exploit their relationship by continuously lowering privacy standards while profiting hand over fist from their growing cache of user data. So I'm hearing that there's some solutions to this issue, particularly around fostering real competition in the digital marketplace, raising privacy standards and user data usage, and empowering consumers. So Ms. Slaiman, can you talk to me about the connection between user privacy, data portability, or interoperability?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. So first, I want to be clear, I don't think that competition will be sufficient to fully address the consumer privacy concerns that public knowledge has, and that I'm sure your constituents have. So we still will need federal privacy legislation to protect users. However, I do think users are already frustrated by not having their privacy protected on these platforms, and they might like to leave, but they feel locked in because of those network effects that you've described. If I'm a frustrated Facebook user, and I am, I would like to leave the platform, and I can't, because I have around 1,000 Facebook friends who are not switching to an alternative platform with me. That makes it much harder for a startup to convince investors that they're going to be successful. Investors know that this lock-in effect is impacting users. So it's a really difficult problem for users, for entrepreneurs, to try to provide a more privacy protective service, or to switch to a more privacy protective service. So interoperability would address that concern. I could switch to the new network and still communicate back with my friends who have not decided yet to make the switch. I could benefit from those privacy protections on the new network and not be isolated from people who are on the incumbent network.
That's interesting. I mean, one of the difficulties in dealing with the issues that we're digging into on this committee is it can get pretty wonky, and trying to translate it for people who are not so deep in the weeds is a problem. So as I try to translate the connection, do I have it correct that if, for example, a new social networking service wanted to offer stronger privacy protections, that some of the things we're talking about here today could help someone switch over to the new service and enjoy the new privacy protections without losing their homeroom moms group or their class reunion Facebook group or something like that?
Yes, I think that's right. So the question about groups is a fairly specific one that we would want to make sure. I think that's something that the regulator could work on to see whether groups can be shared across networks. But certainly it's important to be able to communicate back with friend network connections that you've made on the incumbent social network, in this case, Facebook.
Okay, I would like to seek unanimous consent to enter 2 articles into the record. The first is an article from USA Today dated February 1, 2021, and it's entitled Do Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube censor conservatives? Claims not supported by the facts, new research says. And the second is a new research report from New York University dated February 2021 entitled False Accusation, the Unfounded Claims that Social Media Companies Censor Conservatives. And with that, I would yield back.
Without objection, and the gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gates? No. Now I will recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. And thank you to each of the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to just jump right into this. Mr. Gundersen, I want to jump right into questions and start with you. Your mapping company competes with Google Maps, am I correct?
Correct.
But you're not a web search company, correct?
Correct.
And your business is not cloud storage or cloud computing, is that right?
That is correct.
Great. And so you're a business that competes with one aspect of Google, and that's Google Maps. But you don't compete against Google in these other areas. So let's say I'm an app developer and I want to start a new business from scratch and build a brand new app. Maybe an app to help local businesses maybe deliver goods or services to their customers. And I really like using your mapping tools, but I also want to integrate some aspects of Google Maps search capabilities to help customers find businesses. And then I have another company that is going to give me a really good deal on cloud mapping services. Can I do that? Why or why not?
Technically, you can absolutely, Congresswoman, that's a great question. Technically, you can absolutely select the specific services you want to build the app the exact way. So you can pick search from Google, you can technically pick maps from Mapbox, and you could go to AWS for cloud, for example. And you as a developer need to have that level of decision making to make sure you're picking the right things. Today, the terms of service contractually prohibit you as a developer from using any of Google's search APIs on top of any map that's not Google. And even though there's different products, different API endpoints, and actually monetize differently.
So as the CEO of a mapping company, then is it fair to say that you feel like you are competing with Google Maps just based on who has a better product? Is that fair to say?
No, unfortunately, I'm not able to compete on the product merits. I have customers who, you think about what does it mean when a customer wants you? They're paying you, right? When a customer has to stop paying you and go use a different product only because of the terms of service, that is depriving not just the developers who are our customers of choice, but it has all these downstream implications on consumers to have the right kind of app experience.
So then for the developers that you work with, the businesses that are your customers, these terms like these, they affect them and the products and the choices that they offer, that has a lot of impact on those choices, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so what does this ultimately mean then for the choices that are out there for consumers?
It radically limits the consumer's experiences because it's an upstream issue for the developer, right? If a developer is required to use all things Google just because terms of service, then by definition, all things Google will flow down to the consumer. And this gets to some of the other points coming up on data collection. What does that then start having implications on innovation, right? Because the data that you're collecting today needs to start, it creates a self-learning flywheel. And then next thing you know, it farther expands all products within the Google ecosystem.
So during our investigation, Google said the reason for this limitation in their terms is to prevent negative user experiences, and then they changed the policy itself to specify that the restriction was to, and I quote, avoid quality issues and or brand confusion, end quote. What do you make of that explanation? What do you make of that?
There is, I would love to ask any developers if they ever, or any consumers, if they have any brand confusion here. Like you're in a different app already, right? You know, the map's going to be showing up in a different app. It's going to be customized in a whole bunch of different ways. Like it's meritless. There's not, you don't need to tie all services to one single giant entity to protect for brand confusion. I think it's a recent change. It's a change that came up after we started asking Google for years to change their actual terms.
Well, thank you. And turning to you, Mr. Singer, are issues like this unique to Google, or are there similar situations where contract terms from dominant companies are reducing competition? What are the conditions that allow for this kind of situation?
The time of the gentleladies has expired, but Dr. Singer may answer the question.
Sure. So I'll point to one, if I understand correctly. What are other examples of contract terms that are used by dominant platforms to stymie competition? And I would point to Amazon's effectively a tying arrangement, a tying requirement that's imposed on merchants. And if I understand correctly, if the merchant decides to break the bundle and not comply with the requirement, but instead sources its fulfillment from an independent, that the merchant will be penalized in Amazon's search results. So that would be, I think, a clear example of a contract provision that is undermining competition and should be challenged under the antitrust laws.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the distinguished chairman of the Intellectual Property Subcommittee, Mr. Johnson of Georgia, for 5 minutes. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Maybe his volume is down. Okay, I think Mr. Johnson is recognized for 5 minutes. Now, Mr. Johnson, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Am I up?
I recognize you as the distinguished chairman of the Intellectual Property Subcommittee, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to the esteemed witnesses for appearing before us today. Throughout the 15-month investigation that preceded this solutions hearing, I kept seeing the same thing over and over again: a bigger guy taking advantage of the smaller guy, sometimes through intimidation, other times by putting themselves first and sucking up all the air in the room. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer in big tech today. And we're looking for solutions because it's clear that without intervention, nothing is going to rebalance the scales. The free markets will not rebalance the scales. So we know that there's a problem. We knew it before the series began, but because of the series, we now know how broad the problems are. Ms. Harper, during my questioning of big tech CEOs, I asked Mr. Cook from Apple about the practices of the App Store. I observed that some of the companies, large corporate app owners or even corporate app owners, were given sweetheart deals, but small app owners were forced to pay 30% of their revenues. And other small app developers can't make it past the vetting stage because Apple has decided to introduce their competing app. After understanding what the app developer was proposing to put on their platform, they decided to preempt and put their own app in there. They stole the app owner's idea, in other words. So these are common practices and have an anti-competitive effect. At its heart, treating similar companies differently seems unfair. Why has Apple been allowed to engage in this anti-competitive practice, Ms. Harper?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. You raise a lot of really important issues. And essentially what's happened is a failure of public policy, right? I mean, we have a toolkit, as I referenced earlier in some of the prior questions, we have a toolkit and a historic precedent of how to address these types of extreme market power, which you point out can be predatory, and this kill, copy, acquire approach to running a large company that doesn't leave any room for anyone else to play. And so what I really think we need to consider is, taking on that main issue that we're seeing with other companies as well that have been mentioned here. The dynamic you described with Apple, similar to Amazon having a marketplace and also running its own private label business. The way to get at that is through structural separation. And I'll just add, because I think something that's come up in some of the prior questions is, this either or between the regulation or the structural separation. But really, the historic precedent we have, the American way for dealing with this problem, is a combination of all of those things together. And that's what the subcommittee should move forward with.
Thank you, Ms. Harper. Mr. Singer, in your written testimony, you discussed the use of non-discrimination requirements as a remedy. Do you believe a non-discrimination requirement could be implemented to prevent the behavior that I just described?
Absolutely. I think that you would create a venue in which this victim of discrimination by Apple would be able to put forward a complaint and have his or her day in court and seek relief. And the relief, at a minimum, would be injunctive and any lost profits that was caused by the discriminatory conduct.
Well, your remedy seems to be not in keeping with the Grover Norquist strategy of downsizing the federal government to the degree that you can drown it in a bathtub. Is that philosophy one of the reasons why we have the rise in these four behemoth platforms that no one can compete with?
I think that philosophy did catch on. It might be on its way out, I think, even in Republican circles, that the kind of pure laissez-faire approach to government may be on its way out, thankfully. But that did take hold for certainly the last several decades. And, I'd point back to in 1992 when government used to respond to problems, including gaps in antitrust law. They passed the Cable Act, and the Cable Act was meant to fill a void that the antitrust laws could not address, which was Comcast. I don't mean to pick on them, but other large incumbent cable operators decided to pick off the best ideas of the edge among independent networks, create a clone, and then give preference to their clone on the cable dial by putting their network on the basic tier and moving the independent either completely off or putting them on some expensive tier like the sports tier. Does that sound familiar? And so, the question is, why hasn't Congress acted to fill these voids over the last 20 years?
Thank you.
Well,
I'm sorry. The gentleman's time has expired, but Mr. Johnson, did you have something final you wanted to say?
Well, I was just going to say that most of my friends on the other side of the aisle have signed the Grover Norquist No New Tax pledge, as they have steadily supported cutting revenues to the federal government by cutting taxes. And so this is a problem that needs to be addressed mostly by my friends on the other side of the aisle. Who are they responsible to? Grover Norquist or the people and the consumers and small businesses of America? And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. And in order to be sure that we have a complete record of this hearing and have some additional questions for a couple of the witnesses, Mr. Bishop and I are going to do one kind of wrap up, just a couple of additional questions. I'll now yield to Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I think that last point Mr. Johnson was making, it's always been my view that when tax rates are set low enough for the economy to be robust, more revenues always come to the federal government and the government at all levels. Mr. Thorne, but to pick up, I think, on Mr. Johnson's point just a little bit, and to be a little parochial, here's a self-preference phenomenon example. Apple charges $9.99 a month for a subscription to Apple Music, but $12.99 for a subscription to Spotify. It's obvious what they're doing. Epic Games, a video game company headquartered in my state, attempted to give users playing Fortnite a chance to save money through direct payments, Apple began blocking updates and declined to host Epic Games on its operating system. At the same time, Apple's banning Epic Games from launching a gaming distribution service while promoting its own. So it appears to be a good example of self-preference. And I know, Mr. Singer, I think you've been talk about non-discrimination regime, and you said, I think, Mr. Thorne, the devil's in the details. Can you fill that in a bit? And you can just sort of step away from that if you'd like. If there's any other major point you'd like to sort of wrap up with, we're here at the end of the hearing. I'd appreciate your doing so, and I'll reserve a little time for Professor Lipsky to do the same.
So I would start by saying, Congressman, I do not think that's a parochial concern. I think that's a national concern. And there's a business for $10 or $15 a month subscriptions, and there's a business for free apps where you get ads, and that's how you support it. Apple's about to cut that off. I'm very concerned about the timing. As Congress takes up remedies, as we're between leadership at the Justice Department, Apple was going to do this last year, right before the elections and at the beginning of the holiday selling season, where all of the different campaigns would have been disrupted by what they're about to do, and we were able to hold them off a little bit. But I think this is a bad time for them to be taking new actions to make that problem worse. On Republican enforcement, though, just a word. I am so delighted to be here and to see the strong bipartisan support for focusing on what, as Congresswoman Deming says, is a moral issue. The biggest case right now is the United States case against Google in the D.C. District Court. That was brought under Attorney General William Barr. The biggest case in the state AGs addressing Google is out in Texas with 10 Republican state AGs. I'm really hoping that Democrat AGs will join that case and support it. It's in a fast form. It's teed up in front of a judge that knows how to be a good administrator. But I do not see a lack of Republican enforcement in any way. And again, I'm very grateful for the chance to be here, and I think the problems you're addressing are very important.
Thank you, Mr. Thorne, and I think your point, your comments emphasize the point that, contrary to Mr. Johnson's suggestion, I don't think anybody's proposing a laissez-faire, and I heard you talking about additional enforcement resources and the like, so I don't think that's really on the table. And to compliment Chairman, I think bipartisan advance seems to be particularly possible here, and I appreciate the approach that you've taken to that, Mr. Chairman. And so finally, Professor Lipsky, you've sort of taken it on the chin a couple times today, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to highlight anything you'd like to say at the end.
I'd just like to briefly echo the discussion that you were just engaging in. I think the antitrust community, by which I mean the courts and then the enforcers and the scholars and the lawyers, take great pride in the fact that for many, many years, antitrust has essentially been a nonpartisan effort. And you can find dozens of examples of very serious and well-considered antitrust cases that were started under a Democratic administration and carried forward by Republican administrations and then maybe finished up in a Republican or a Democratic administration. We take pride in the fact that this is a very fundamental national economic policy that has produced wonderful results. It's made our country the economic powerhouse of the world, and part of the basis for that is that we make decisions on the law and the facts and sound economics and not on partisanship. And finally, I would just like to say that you must recognize that this spectacular success of the technology companies, and this does not exempt them or in any way forgive any anti-competitive conduct that they might have engaged in. But that spectacular success is in many respects a product of this wonderful combination of the antitrust laws focus on prohibiting anti-competitive conduct and the Article 3 courts' independence and judicious ability to exercise independent judgment and make sound decisions based on economics and the facts and the law. And we don't want to undermine those elements of the system that produce this wonderful innovation and success.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I just want to follow up on a couple of things. And of course, the spectacular success that Professor Lipsky speaks about has brought different consequences for innovators, consumers, and workers, and that's the very reason we're having this hearing and we conducted this investigation. So, but there's been a lot of discussion with respect to the issues of portability and interoperability, where I think there's a lot of consensus in the committee. But one of the issues, or one of the solutions or remedies that is most exciting to me, and I think to other members of the committee, is the structural separation remedy. And Ms. Harper, you in your written testimony note, and I'm quoting you, Amazon runs the infrastructure for modern commerce and engages in a host of anti-competitive practices, such as predatory pricing, leveraging its dominance from one market into another, self-preferencing its own products, tying its services to extract more money from those who use its services, and weaponizing counterfeit products. Would you speak to how structural separation or line of business restrictions, what I like to refer to as the Glass-Steagall of the internet, can address this anti-competitive conduct, and whether or not really it's, in your view, the only remedy that will comprehensively address the practices that you just described in your testimony?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be at the hearing. Yeah, actually, it is my view that this is the only way to take on the level of gatekeeping power and dominance that I described in the written testimony and that you just alluded to, in terms of the different lines of business that they are operating in, because they have near perfect market intelligence. It allows them to squash other businesses that are coming even close to threatening them on even specific product lines. And it's not possible through regulation alone. And just to make a couple of more points there, because we need to also look back, and I know something was referenced about being logical and careful and all of that. Well, we should be careful and look at what has worked and what hasn't worked before, right? Like if you look at policy regulations, singular regulations in Europe, for example, that did not actually address the problem. It only made the Facebook and Google dominance more entrenched. And so that's why we really recommend the structural separation piece, because then it also is ultimately easier to administer, which is something that also has come up. It recognizes the humility of regulation, right? Like we can only do so much through individual agencies, but if we take the root cause of the issue, address these conflicts of interest and the incentives, then we'll be able to restore competition to the marketplace.
And, that was similar testimony that was provided in the last Congress by Sally Hubbard from the Open Markets Institute, who testified that Congress should structurally eliminate the platform's conflict of interest and remove their incentives and ability to self-preference, and should separate platforms from commerce into best business lines. And so I guess my final question for you is, how would that work? I mean, can you just sort of speak to how Congress would actually make that happen, how it would be operationalized?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would involve passing statutes that address this specific market. And, again, as I've alluded to, that's very much in line with prior historic moments where we face this type of dominant power, railroads in the telecom industry. This body, this institution, Congress, recognized that it wasn't sustainable to let this type of power continue, and acted accordingly through enacting statutes and then ultimately making changes to the law that enabled more competition. So similarly, just like is covered in the subcommittee report, we would recommend moving forward with those types of recommendations.
Thank you so much. And my final question, Mr. Gundersen, is for you. In your written testimony, you explained the problem of Google's anti-competitive tying of Google search with Google Maps, and you say it will get more complicated in the future, and you point to this deal between Google Maps and Ford as an example of how Google's subscription bundling of services is creating a full ecosystem lock-in. Could you speak a little bit about what you mean by that, and how the expansion into the sort of auto technology will reinforce the monopoly power of Google in search and a dominant position in numerous other markets like advertising and cloud computing, and what it might mean in terms of the privacy concerns it might raise in terms of the data that they'll have the ability to collect?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. That it's the data piece that is just so critical here. Monopoly power is at the root cause of this. What's going on right now is not just price positioning. You're getting access to all the data. Like if all the sensor data in the car, it's not just about the user app data, but the map and the operating system, all the way down to all the data coming off the vehicle back to the cloud. My gosh, this is how all AI learns. It's all about data. The decisions this committee makes now are going to have major ramifications on the future of search and the future of artificial intelligence and further consolidation. This is data.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gundersen. I now seek unanimous consent to add a number of letters and statements to the record regarding the proposals discussed today to limit gatekeeper power and increase competition online. Without objection, Mr. Bishop is recognized for unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's to seek, and I don't know if it's one among the letters you're referring to, but a letter to you and Mr. Buck from the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir.
This concludes today's hearing, and I again want to thank our distinguished witnesses for their testimony, which is really going to provide enormous assistance as the committee shapes the legislative remedies that the investigation calls for. I thank all of the witnesses for their time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Our next hearing, which will happen just in a couple of weeks, will address the news crisis, the crisis of local journalism, and the impact of the large technology platforms in facilitating that crisis and some proposed responses. Again, with gratitude, this hearing is adjourned.
Nice job, Hal. Well, that was fun. Thanks, you too.
Okay, hi there, and welcome to a video looking at some A-star evaluation points to do with the very important topic of barriers to entry and exit in markets. So barriers to entry are best defined, I think, as anything designed to block potential entrants from entering a market in the long run and making a profit. And there are many different types of entry barriers. Some of them are structural, to do with cost. Others are strategic, to do with the actual behavior of existing firms in the industry. Economies of scale is one of your go-to points. Oftentimes there is an asymmetry in costs between the existing firm, the established business, if you like, that's been in the market for some time, and the potential entrant, the new kid on the block. And if existing businesses have managed to exploit economies of scale, can you visualize a diagram of that? If they've managed to develop a cost advantage, then if a new supplier enters the market, they can cut their prices, perhaps obviously take a loss, perhaps a lower profit in the short term, but effectively block a new firm, for example, using limit pricing. But there are many other types of barriers to entry to be aware of. Vertical integration, control of the supply chain from extraction to distribution to manufacturing and eventual to selling. Brand loyalty is obviously very important, having that kind of sense of customer loyalty to your product. That reduces the cross-price elasticity of demand. Oftentimes businesses have control of important platforms. A really good example there is Amazon Web Service, which has established a dominant platform business in cloud computing. Expertise, goodwill, business reputation, hugely important. Again, one of the advantages of being early into a market and developing a good reputation going forward. And of course, there are legal barriers such as trademarks and copyright and patents, the ways in which you can protect your intellectual property against the ambitions of a rival firm. So those are some examples just to set us up in terms of the evaluation. Next question is to ask this one: why are entry barriers in a market significant? Well, first of all, the height of the hurdle of the barrier will affect the concentration of a market in the long run. So typically when the entry barriers are high, the concentration ratio will tend to be pretty high, perhaps even an oligopoly, where 5 firms have more than 60% of the market. High entry barriers and exit costs, including sunk costs, well, they tend to make a market less contestable. And that's a really important market structure to understand. This then influences the actual conduct of firms, the behavior of firms in an industry. For example, pricing of products, market power with barriers to entry can then lead to a loss of allocative efficiency with price above marginal and average cost. And a lot of economists argue that the absence of competition, when there are big barriers to entry, that could also be a negative in terms of affecting dynamic efficiency and also productive efficiency, the possibility, for example, of X inefficiencies. So barriers to entry are significant, and of course they will vary from industry to industry. Now here's a key question. Are entry barriers in different markets coming down? Are markets becoming more contestable over time? Let me share with you 6 reasons why entry barriers could well be coming down in lots of different markets. Who knows, you may get a data response question which gives you just this opportunity to make these points. First of all, we're seeing the rise of lean startups. These are businesses, startup businesses, that can break into the market on the back of just a very minimum viable product. They don't want to be the fully finished version. They try and break into a market with a minimum viable product, a test product if you like, see what the reaction is, get the feedback, and then constantly iterate the product until they have a fully fleshed out product ready to launch or to break into the market. A lot of businesses are using lean startup techniques, associated of course with the journalist and the author Eric Ries. Other businesses are growing very quickly, breaking down the barriers to entry by using disruptive pricing models. They don't necessarily follow traditional pricing. They may well use algorithmic pricing, dynamic pricing, to try to price their way into different markets. Increasingly, firms are making savvy and successful use of social media to generate viral marketing effects, and that can cut the costs of attracting new sales. Marketing costs in the past have been obviously a big barrier to entry. Perhaps that's coming down. The sharing economy is growing. Instead of having to buy expensive capital equipment, there are now lots of businesses that allow you to lease equipment, to buy retail space. The rise of the pop-up shop, for example, or the pop-up cinema, is where you're leasing space or shops or other facilities. Increasingly online, businesses can make good use of open source software and sales platforms, such as Amazon Web Service. That, again, reduces the cost of entering the market. And a lot of businesses now are lean, flexible manufacturing businesses. They only produce when there's a demand. Perhaps they might crowdfund an initial product. They might go for mass customization, in other words, slightly oxymoronic, but they might be selling a new brand of shoes, for example, sports shoes, which are customized to each individual customer's needs and wants, obviously willing to pay a high price for that, printed on demand, manufactured on demand, instead of going for vast, big batch jobs of production, which obviously are very costly. All kinds of reasons looking at this slide why in many markets businesses are breaking down those entry barriers. Now, what's the advantages of this? This is, again, part of the evaluation. So if entry barriers are coming down, if they are, that's not true for all industries. What are the advantages? Well, first of all, a market becomes more contestable in the long run. And here are 4 in theory points you might want to stress. First of all, in theory, competition drives down the price. You should be able to show a diagram, for example, showing how competition could lead to a lower price in the market. That increases consumer surplus. You can show that. It increases real incomes after inflation. It can improve affordability of products for people on average or below average incomes. In theory, faster competition, more intense competition, improves product quality and also drives dynamic innovation. In theory, competition is a factor catalyzing higher productivity and a more efficient allocation of scarce resources. At a macro level, barriers to entry coming down, improved efficiency and productivity can then make a country more competitive in global markets. So in a nutshell, there are some static and dynamic gains from barriers to entry coming down. But of course we have to evaluate. We have to offer that kind of A-star evaluation perspective. So what are some of the drawbacks from lower entry barriers? Well, let me give you 5 points here. In theory, good, but in practice, profits go down. Well, that might reduce the amount of money available for businesses to fund much needed capital investment. Consider, for example, investment needed in telecoms or water or power industries. In practice, profits go down. Well, that could lead to less tax revenues for the government. Can they find alternative sources of tax revenue? In practice, barriers to entry coming down might be good, but the rapid entry of new firms could actually lead to oversupply. Too many firms entering the market, perhaps dragging prices lower than they would otherwise be, and that could actually threaten the sustainability of the industry. If too many renewable energy firms enter the market, perhaps the price of renewable energy will be so low that actually the sustainability of the industry, of a sustainable industry, could be threatened. In practice, technological innovations which help bring down barriers to entry, they're good, but in practice there could be some higher structural unemployment, people who lose their jobs as a result. Can they find work? Do they have the sufficient occupational mobility to be able to find work? And a really subtle point, I think, but low barriers to entry, again, in theory, provides more contestability, but it's actually no guarantee that's the case. And there's a kind of line of thinking at the moment that some of the old established monopolies are disappearing, some of them, but actually they might just be replaced by new ones. So the old black cab monopoly in London's streets, is that being replaced by a new Uber-esque monopoly and other businesses like it? So you have to be careful what you consider in terms of monopoly in the market definition, but there are some evaluation points. It's always good to have a few examples of contestable markets for your exam. You may well be given some in a data response question, but here are some examples that could be used for essays. Funding Circle challenging the banks in terms of lending. Five Guys breaking into the UK casual dining sector. I love a Five Guys, by the way. Airbnb's impact on the hotel industry, very interesting case study. Amazon now setting up its own bookshops. GEMS Education disrupting the private education market in London and many other countries. Obviously Uber and other services providing contestability in city transport. The rise of the retail energy firms such as First Shell, the energy renewable energy company, and others. And Uber breaking into the freight logistics sector. There's lots of good examples of contestability. If you get a data response question, you have to use the data provided. But if you get an essay question, you can choose the ground you write on. I think a great example is the parcel sector. This is my last slide in this video. Parcel sector is an industry which has become much more competitive. Deregulation has been a factor allowing more firms into the market. So the monopoly that once was enjoyed by the Royal Mail has largely disappeared. Now there is so much competition, particularly city to city, nationwide parcel services such as FedEx and DPD and Yodel and many others besides. But yet the competition grows more fierce. Click and collect, the rise of China Post, intelligent parcel locker businesses, 3D printing technology. Instead of having stuff delivered, print stuff at home, and much else besides. This is a really good example of where, when the barriers to entry come down, the scale and intensity of competition goes up. So there we go, some evaluation points on the really key topic of barriers to entry and exit. Thank you. Okay, hello, welcome to a video looking at barriers to entry and market power. So what are barriers to entry? Well, basically it's any strategy put in place by an existing firm, a well-established business, designed to block potential entrants, potential rival firms, from entering a market profitably. Essentially, barriers to entry try to protect the existing firm's market power and maintain supernormal profits in the long term and increase producer surplus, so that profit may find its way back, of course, to shareholders. There are many examples of barriers to entry, and we'll certainly come across quite a few of them in this short revision video. Perhaps the biggest, perhaps the most significant barrier is the cost asymmetry between an established firm in a market and a potential rival. And this can be due to economies of scale. You see, if you've been in the market for some time, you may well have scaled up production of a good or service, and that has allowed you to exploit economies of scale, which have brought down your long-term, long and average cost. That can lead to a cost asymmetry. In other words, the existing firms have lower costs of supply than the potential rival. We'll come back to that in a second. Linked to it is vertical integration, where businesses have control of the supply chain. Perhaps you have a business that can literally control the chain from extraction of natural resources all the way through to the final products heading to the consumer. Vertical integration often gives firms cost advantages, which basically cement their market power. And brand loyalty is also very important as a barrier to entry. When brand loyalty is high, the cross-price elasticity of demand tends to go down. You see, what matters here is that consumers are less willing to switch if a new firm comes into the market. And strong brand loyalty increases the marketing costs of breaking into a market successfully. Just want to spend a little while with you thinking about why economies of scale matter as a barrier to entry. And in particular, what do we mean by a cost asymmetry between established and new firms? Well, the cost asymmetry is where the incumbent firm, in other words, the existing firm, they have lower costs than one or more of their potential entrants. And that means, for example, that if a new firm enters a market, the established firm might be able to take advantage of those lower costs by cutting prices and making life pretty tough for the rival firms coming in. One way of looking at this is to use cost and revenue curve analysis. I just wanted to take you through this. It's a good way of getting high marks for analysis in your A-level and IB answers. I've assumed here constant cost. The marginal and average cost of production is constant. That saves me drawing all those fiddly cost curves. So basically the supply curve is the cost curve for the established firm, and they could well profit maximize at output Q1, and the price is shown there because they have market power. Now, cost asymmetry means that their costs, their average and marginal costs are lower than a potential new entrant. And I've drawn the new entrant's costs in on the diagram in purple here. Can you see that? There is quite a big gap, quite a big cost advantage between the existing firm and the rival firm. So this analysis assumes that the existing firms have a cost advantage. Now, why does that matter? Well, it gives them scope to use something called limit pricing. Limit pricing is basically where a firm who's been in the market for some time tries to deter the entry or the expansion of new firms. They do this by setting a price that's below their own profit maximizing price, but above the competitive level, and perhaps a price below what they perceive to be the costs of the new firms. Limit pricing means a short-term departure from profit maximization. Let's go back to our diagram. Can you see here that the purple lines above the orange line, the existing firm, has lower costs than the new entrant? Now, at the moment, they're charging a profit maximizing price, but of course they don't have to do that. For example, they could charge this limit price a lower price, sell more output, Q2. Now, they're making less profit, but can you see they're pricing below the costs of a new entrant, which would make life tough for new firms trying to break into the market. And who knows, those firms may not come in which case the firm can then revert back to their original profit maximizing equilibrium. Limit pricing on the basis of cost asymmetries is a good example to use of a barrier to entry, a strategic barrier to entry used by existing firms. Lots of other entry barriers. It may well be the case that you have control of a key platform. Amazon Web Service is a good example of that. You may well have some intellectual property protected by trademarks and copyrights and patents. So on the bottom right there, we would call those legal barriers to entry. And actually the one I've left until last is the middle of the bottom row there. The expertise, the goodwill, and the reputation of existing firms is something that cannot be underestimated. Once you've been in a market for some time, it's linked to brand loyalty for sure, but once customers are habitual purchasers of a product, they understand a business, they have a good relationship, and the business has managed to build up goodwill and hopefully good reputation, that can be a major barrier to entry of new firms. So why are entry barriers significant? Well, essentially the height of a barrier to entry if you like, the height of the hurdle that new firms must get over, is going to affect the concentration of a market in the long run. In technical terms, what we say is that when the entry barriers are high, and when there are also exit costs, the cost of leaving a market, that makes a market less contestable. Consequence can be that the existing firms can charge monopoly prices, and they can use their market power to make supernormal profits, leading to a loss of allocative efficiency. And there's some thinking as well that when the barriers to entry are high, when contestability is low, that can also cause dynamic and productive efficiency to suffer. There could be some exit inefficiencies, there could be some diseconomies of scale, and perhaps a slowdown in the pace of innovation. A good example to use is to think about a market you may not know too much about, the commercial banking sector. Some examples of barriers to entry in the commercial banking market. Firms like Metro Bank and Revolut and Monzo have tried to break into a market that's dominated by the likes of Barclays and HSBC, for example. And here are some of the barriers to entry. First of all, you need a license. There are regulatory barriers in the market. So you need a license. The Bank of England needs to allocate licenses to give you the legal right to operate and take deposits from savers, for example. And then there are those kind of natural barriers to entry, those entry costs. You need to spend money on marketing. You need to build your IT and payments infrastructure. That's crucial, obviously, in banking. The existing banks have probably vertically integrated. They've got big branch networks, perhaps. They've got a lot of consumer loyalty. I've personally been with my own bank now for over 30 years. Haven't really thought of switching. Doesn't cross my mind. And there's something called first mover advantage, that the existing banks, by building up brand loyalty, if they're in there first, they can make life tough for new entrants. And of course, they've got access to market funding because they've got a reputation. However, there is some evidence that the UK banking sector, commercial banks, is becoming more contestable. Perhaps the barriers to entry are coming down. You have some pretty established challengers. First Direct, Metro, TSB, Trustees Savings Bank, which demerged from Lloyds 3 years ago. Virgin Money is quite a significant player. They bought the Northern Rock branch network when that business got into difficulty. Then you've got your online-only banks. Some of you may know businesses like Monzo and Zopper and Tandem. The supermarkets, of course, have tried to break into the banking sector. Asda Money, M&S, Sainsbury's. Tesco has had a bank. I think they've closed that. But the supermarkets, quite big players. So too the emergence of fintech companies, Azimo, iZettle and Curve. And who knows, the next wave, the digital platform companies, Apple Pay, Google Pay, Amazon. Who knows, Google, Apple and Amazon could well be big players in the banking sector, in the financial services, big players, really significant entrants in the years to come. So perhaps those barriers to entry are coming down. And some economists make the case for saying, actually, yes, the barriers to entry in many industries are perhaps getting lower. So we'll finish with this, actually, and think about some of the reasons why that's the case. One is the rise of sort of lean startups. These are businesses. Eric Ries wrote the book on this called The Lean Startup. These are businesses which basically try and fly with a minimum of cost. And their aim is to get a minimum viable product, like an app, for example, onto the market as soon as they can, get it up and running, see what the reaction is to it, constant iteration, constant new versions, and see where the app or the business flies. A lot of businesses are not thinking the orthodox, so they're very disruptive. So you think about, for example, businesses such as Uber coming in, and Airbnb, and the low-cost airlines, and the deep discounters such as Aldi and Lidl. They often have different pricing models, for example, than the established firms, successfully breaking into markets. Quite a few firms are superb, absolutely amazing at viral marketing. They've got savvy social media teams, very young, dynamic media teams, and they're very successful in breaking into markets because they can market their products at the fraction of the cost of the old scale firms. In class, we thought about, I asked my students for some examples, and they came up with Gymshark, very, very successful emerging UK sports fashion brand, and Depop, of course, which is a platform for training trading personal items. The sharing economy is growing. A lot of businesses now lease rather than buy equipment. They lease retail space, pop-up shops, leased capital equipment. That brings down the cost and the risk of entering a market. A lot of businesses rely heavily on open source software, which is freely available to build an app and develop a payment system. And increasingly, we're also seeing the rise of flexible manufacturing. This is where businesses use things like additive printers, 3D printers. The rise of self-publishing is a good example of flexible manufacturing, trying to break into the publishing market. Well, just be flexible, be low cost, be lean, and see where it gets you. So perhaps the entry barriers are coming down. A really good example is the parcel industry. There is now intense competition between lots and lots of parcel firms, including Parcel Force, the Royal Mail Business, FedEx, DPD and Hermes, etc. And of course there's way more competition than there ever was. And a lot of these businesses are now well-known brands. They're scaled and they offer a full range of services. And of course, even they are now facing even more competition from click and collect, from supermarkets, from intelligent parcel locker businesses, and from businesses such as Uber and Shuttle, which is bought by eBay. Lots of, again, little players in the market challenging the dominance of existing players. So this is a really interesting topic. Any market where existing players can try to prevent the entry of new rivals is where you're going to bring into your discussion, into your analysis, and I hope your evaluation too, the nature of barriers to entry. It's one of those topics where if you've got some good examples, you'll be in fantastic shape to write a top answer. Okay, I hope you found that useful, and thanks for joining me.